Oh, Diego's bio.
He didn't send it yet.
Okay.
Oh, we're live. Okay, we are live. Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to our special live stream from Caracas in Venezuela, where we just witnessed a historic election. I am Rania Khalek of Breakthrough News, and I am joined by my superstar colleague, the editor-in-chief of People's Dispatch, Zoe Alexandra. It's an honor to be sitting with you.
Hey, Rania, very excited for this conversation.
Yeah, so we've got a really, really great show for you guys with a bunch of awesome guests who are going to come and give us a breakdown post-election, post-presidential election in Venezuela of what happened yesterday, what happened in the preceding weeks, what's going on now. Zoe actually was at Miraflores last night after it was announced that President Nicolas Maduro was reelected for a third term. So we're really excited to bring you all of those details. We're also going to talk about who is the Venezuelan opposition who lost last night. What are they saying and doing now? What do we expect to come? What was the U.S. role in all of this? What's the regional role? How is the region responding? We've got lots of great guests, a great lineup to come. But before we start, Zoe, since you were there last night, tell us what you saw at Miraflores.
Yeah, well, we went down to Miraflores last night around 10 p.m. There was already a call for people to go to Miraflores because July 28th is actually the birthday of Hugo Chavez. So there was a call for people to go and celebrate the birthday and to wait for the results to come. People very anxiously waiting, listening to all of the campaign songs and rallying songs. And at around midnight, just past midnight, the president of the National Electoral Council made the announcement in the CNA in Caracas of the electoral results with 80% of the ballots counted. He announced that 59% of the Venezuelan electorate participated and announced the results, which we now know now, which is that Nicolas Maduro won the elections with 51% and Edmundo González lost in second place, with the other candidates coming in with lower numbers. It was, in a very celebratory mood. I think we can perhaps pull up one of the clips of just the massive people's celebration that was taking place outside of Miraflores. Thousands of people were out there. I'm going to ask our technic to pull up a clip from last night at Miraflores so that people can see it for themselves, exactly how the Venezuelan people actually celebrate democracy. Great. So, yeah, we were out there, and Nicolas Maduro then made a speech talking a lot about the need to unite all of the political and social sectors in the country, talking about the threat of the right and what the right represents. I know we're going to have amazing guests, so we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but really emphasizing the fact that in 2024, Venezuela has, successfully defeated this far-right opposition, this threat of an opposition that wanted to, for the past 10 years, essentially support the campaign of U.S. sanctions, to support these coup attempts, to support all of these efforts to undermine Venezuelan democracy. And yesterday, the Venezuelan people said no to that proposal. So it was an explosive mood last night. We were out there until about 2 a.m., just talking to people, getting a sense of how people were feeling about the results. And I'm excited to talk more about what they mean.
Yeah, and I just want to add, Zoe and I have both been here for several days ahead of the election. We got to go to a bunch of polling places yesterday, and there's just been this tsunami of misinformation from Western corporate media, international corporate media, actually, I would say, trying to frame this as full of irregularities, as fraudulent. I mean, I'm talking not just weeks, but months before it even started. Yeah. You heard from U.S. officials that this was a fraudulent election, which is insane. I mean, it hasn't even happened yet. There's already fraud. And just to be clear, there were over 800 international observers who were dispatched across Venezuela yesterday to every state, to polling stations across the country to basically observe and to make sure there weren't irregularities. And so it's very rare to have a country, and Venezuela is forced to do it because they're up against the U.S., that has to just open up its polling stations to international observers, to international organizations, one of which is the Carter Center. And also the opposition. I want to be clear because the New York Times has repeatedly said this lie that the opposition wasn't allowed to observe. They, in fact, were allowed to observe. In fact, at a polling station near the hotel that we're staying at, which is in a pretty, I think, opposition-heavy area, a couple hundred opposition activists like forced their way into the polling station to observe the count. So, in fact, you are being lied to if you're reading the New York Times. They are allowed to observe. And I just, before we get started here and bring in our first guest, I want to also add that last night, Maria Corina Machado, who wasn't running, she's this U.S.-backed woman. She's received a lot of backing from the U.S. and in the past over 2 decades has participated in several failed coup attempts against the Venezuelan government backed by the U.S. She wasn't allowed to run because of that, but she's essentially like the leader of the right-wing opposition, far right-wing opposition, even if she wasn't allowed to run. And after Maduro gave his acceptance speech last night, she went on national television and claimed, not only refused to recognize the results of this election, she also absurdly claimed that the opposition won every single state in the country and that they won 70% of the vote. So that's how the right wing so far is responding to this. There are some anxieties about potential violent backlash from the right wing opposition, but we've yet to see that come to fruition. And all that's to say, I mean, I don't know if you have anything to add about that, Zoe, but it was just pretty insane to witness. It was very Trumpian. In fact, kind of worse than Trumpian, because Trump didn't go around after the last election and say, oh, I won every single state at 70% of the vote.
He was a bit more moderated. But I think what's important to point out is that also in her, this kind of bizarre parallel universe press conference where she says that they won by 70%. And by the way, we won is a bizarre thing because, as you said, she wasn't a candidate. But all that aside, she also said she called on people to be ready to mobilize. And she said, please wait for instructions on further actions. So, it's important, as you said, to be vigilant and be ready to know what's coming next. This is a right-wing opposition that has repeatedly called for violent protests against the government. Thankfully, our next guests and our next couple of guests are going to go in a little more detail about this. But important to keep in mind that when she says be ready for further actions, that, there's a lot on the line right now.
And on that note, we do have our first guest joining us in studio. Very excited. And again, we are coming to you from on the ground in Caracas, post-election. We have Manolo de los Santos, who is the executive director of the People's Forum in New York City. If you are in New York City and haven't checked it out, you absolutely should go check it out. Manolo, welcome.
Well, it's exciting times to be in Caracas with y'all.
Very exciting. And Manolo, can we get right into it? Talk to us about the latest developments and what has been the response of the right to this victory of Maduro last night, the victory of the Great Patriotic Poll.
Well, I think when we look at the timeline, I would say the last 24 hours, even before the polls closed, they were technically supposed to close at 6 p.m., but Venezuelan law says they can't actually close till the last person on the line votes. Before any of that happened, already leading right-wing figures in the region, everyone from President Milei in Argentina, who is a neoliberal fascist, to Bolsonaro and many others, and certain governments, Paraguay, Panama, and others, already began to make statements that in a sense began to contradict each other. On one hand, they would say things like, the opposition has a 40% lead, they have 70% of the vote, Maduro is absolutely going to lose. And at the same time, they began to bring in or put in sort of a seed of doubt. Where are the results? We want the results. There's a possibility of fraud. Fraud. Brian Nichols from the State Department goes in, again, before the polls even close, to make statements about the results. Ultimately, these people didn't actually have any evidence. They didn't actually have any numbers. The only thing they had was a poll, an exit poll, actually funded by the Wall Street Journal, with a limited size of data that pointed to a wrong result. But ultimately, they all ignored the actual election authorities in Venezuela. So this created a huge sense of deception among people on the opposition. And then I would say, the sympathizers of the far right across the world and in Latin America specifically, who really thought they had it in the bag. But ultimately, the people spoke. I mean, the numbers are clear. And it wasn't that the opposition didn't have free and fair elections. I mean, they actually ran and they did, I would say, considerably well considering the conditions. They got 44% of the vote.
Yeah.
It's just Maduro got more. That's how elections go.
Well, you know how the U.S. is. They only like elections when it goes their way. But you know what I found really interesting, Manolo, is the fact that you had these U.S. officials tweeting out these statements about how long it was taking for the results to come in. I mean, the polls closed, I think, after 6, actually, because people kept voting after 6. So it probably took about 5 hours from when they closed, maybe 4 to 5 hours, to when we got the results of the election. And I mean, when you compare that to U.S. time, I mean, I remember the last presidential election, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it took several days to declare a winner in that election. Because
I did the math.
Yeah.
It took over 3 days to finally verify the results of the elections in the U.S. It took over 3 days to declare an actual winner.
But listen, I raised that to say, it's very important to that juxtaposition, but I raised that to say, you know, reading the corporate media framing of what happened yesterday, we hear there's irregularities at polling stations, that there's potential fraud, that like all of these just list of grievances of the opposition after they lost. Can you talk about the actual process that took place in Venezuela? I mean, you know, in my personal opinion, from what I witnessed, it was a far more transparent process than I've ever seen in the U.S., for example.
Well, you know, the Venezuelans are actually recognized by a majority of countries around the world for actually having one of the most efficient and transparent election systems in the world. I mean, it's a voting system in which people are able to vote in less than a minute. I mean, it actually cuts out the long lines that are characteristics of elections in most parts of the third world. And it's a system that is heavily monitored and is actually audited. It's the only voting system in the world where, as people are voting, as the tallies are being made, 54% of the votes are actually audited independently. Automatically, you know? It's almost like a perfect election system. We can't exactly say it's absolutely perfect, but it's near perfect. And the fact is that it's been working. And in fact, it's worked so well that opposition figures have won elections using the same voting system multiple times over the last 20 plus years. In fact, many members of the current National Assembly that belong to the same opposition parties are there because they won through that same system. So to call fraud simply because Brian Nichols says it's fraud, simply because Washington says it's fraud, a country that ultimately has no legitimacy to talk about fair elections when, A, they suppress votes in their own country, and secondly, the U.S. is guilty of interfering and, you know, organizing coups, all sorts of plots against democracies around the world. I mean, it wasn't that long ago in this same region, the wounds haven't closed of a coup against Salvador Allende. There was literally a coup attempt in Bolivia less than a month ago. So to talk about democracy and ignore the fact that Venezuela actually demonstrates the capacity to allow millions of people to participate is amazing.
Well, you know, touching on that point about the U.S. role and the U.S. role in the region, can you actually go a little deeper? What has been the U.S. role in these elections? What has been the connection between the U.S. and this far-right opposition that we saw contest the polls yesterday?
Well, I would say it's almost a parasitical relationship between the United States government and the far-right opposition. Going back to 2002, essentially the far-right in Venezuela was given a blank check by the U.S. government to go and use any means necessary to try to overthrow a democratically elected government. And this far-right opposition, rather than going to democracy, rather than going to the polls, rather than organizing people, has consistently used coups. It tried to take over the oil industry and destroy it. They have killed hundreds of protesters who didn't align with their views. They have consistently asked and requested for foreign intervention, and not just foreign intervention, but actual invasions. They have supported mercenary groups that have led terrorist attacks on the Venezuelan people. These are the guys that Washington has chosen. And again, this is not something that started yesterday or even a few weeks ago or even a year ago. This has been going on for over 20 years of the U.S. simply not learning a lesson. It keeps choosing the wrong people. And the wrong people who end up having the worst methods for achieving their aims. Ultimately, that has taken away their legitimacy and their credibility in the eyes of the Venezuelan people. Because when you actually look at what was the election program of the far right, it was privatize it all. The slogan was privatize it all. Privatize education, privatize healthcare, privatize housing. I mean, is that really how you're going to get millions of people to really vote for change? Are you going to get people to vote for change by telling them we want more sanctions if we lose? It's really shameful. But ultimately it plays in line with what Washington's agenda has been all along, which is that it wants Venezuelan oil, it wants Venezuela's vast natural resources, no matter what the cost, no matter who the intermediaries are. I mean, we have to remember they even went as far as creating a fictitious president, Juan Guaido, who now lives at Langley, in order to justify their claims over Venezuelan oil.
Well, I want to ask you also to zoom out regionally as well. I mean, obviously, like Latin America region, forget the U.S. for a moment, but also these are tools of the Americans, because you had a response before the election by the various right-wing and not even so right-wing leaders across the region, calling it fraud, saying that the results, like if Maduro wins, aren't going to be accepted. He's a dictator, and on and on and on. So there is, and you know, I think there's something really interesting that Maduro said in a speech I got to see him give a few days ago, where he pointed out that these people like Javier Milei, like Jair Bolsonaro, he said they were born in Venezuela, because he basically said the Venezuelan right is basically what birthed this movement we've seen across the region. So what has been the role of the Latin American right in this election?
Well, I don't like to correct President Maduro, but I would go further and say that the Venezuelan far right has indeed launched these far right movements across Latin America, but the real parents of this are in Washington. Actually, they're more precisely in Langley, Virginia. These are the people in the CIA who constructed these figures, who created their agendas, who created their discourse, who put the resources for them to meet each other and to organize with each other, who basically articulated and created a network that spans not just in Latin America, but even further beyond. I mean, they're basically networks of the far right in Europe, from Marine Le Pen to Milei, who all hang out and they gather at CPAC conventions, but they also gather in private spaces where they actively talk about how to subvert democratic processes in the region. And their ties to Venezuela is that they have created this fictitious war. They say they are in a war against cultural Marxism, a war against socialist values, who they consider to be anti-family and anti-human rights and anti-democracy. But they have no real political project of their own. They have no real proposals. Milei became famous by literally saying, we're going to strip down the state. Bolsonaro, in moments of COVID, response was, why have a health ministry? These are the politics of the far right. And they come together, in Venezuela, in that ultimately they all see the socialist government of Venezuela as the biggest threat to the expansion of their political project in the region. They continue to see Venezuela as a bulwark of progressive values, of progressive ideas, of progressive governance, an example of what actually it means to have a state that cares for people, even under difficult circumstances. That counters all of their visions of what they want the future to be. And I think because the far right in Latin America is a child of the US, ultimately the US woke up quite dumbfounded with the results. I don't think Washington has fully comprehended what's at play. They haven't comprehended that the Venezuelan people, despite over a decade of cruel sanctions, actually believe in this political project, actually feel invested in what they've been building here. Because ultimately it's about being able to take their kids to school every morning and being able to have housing at the end of the day and being able to actually make it to the next day. That is something that the far right is scared of. They are scared of the Venezuelan people, just like the U.S. government is.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely all eyes on Venezuela. of course, the far right ahead of these elections across Latin America was also creating their show, as Maduro said, with the alleged electoral observers that were denied entry. A lot of different, seemingly orchestrated media charades. But before we let you go, Manolo, hoping you can talk about what is next, what comes next. So this victory yesterday, we've seen responses from the right. We've seen responses from the U.S. We've seen responses from regional actors. We've seen that the ALBA TCP states immediately came out and recognized the victory, as well as several other countries across the world. It's now 12 noon, Monday, July 29th. What can we expect in the coming days?
Well, I think there's a polarizing line that grows deeper in the world between countries that defend independence, that defend their sovereignty, that do not bow to the interests of the United States government, who all came out in defense and recognition of Venezuela's democracy. They didn't came to cheer one candidate or the other. They came to respect Venezuela's democracy, to respect the choices of the Venezuelan people. The people spoke and the revolution won in a very fair and clean process. But then we see the other side of the line, which is where governments that have no dignity, that have no sense of independence, that have no sovereignty, some of them who even consider themselves progressive, like government of Chile, who immediately bowed down to the pressure of the US government, who is essentially going to spend the next few days pressuring all of its allies. I would say some of its subjects, some of its countries that it holds under its thumb, to not recognize these democratic results. But ultimately, the reality is that Venezuela has been living under that similar reality for the last few years. Recognized or not by one government or the other, the Venezuelan people still have a project to build. And I think what comes next is, how do the Venezuelan people deepen this process of democracy? How do they continue to build a state that meets the needs of its people despite cruel sanctions? How do they develop their economy? How do they continue to feed millions of people? And how do they do something which is actually, I would say, special to the Venezuelan process? How do they keep opening the doors so that many Venezuelan migrants can continue to come back home, as many have already?
Well, on that note, Manolo, we appreciate you joining us for this special live edition of a crossover event between People's Dispatch and Breakthrough News. Everybody who, can you just actually remind people where they can follow you, because you're in Venezuela right now, and it still remains to be seen how things will play out over the next couple of days. Yes,
I plan to stay in Venezuela just for a little bit more to observe how things go. I'll be tweeting things out more and more from on my Twitter and my Instagram and sharing information. But we have to thank the independent media outlets like Breakthrough News, like People's Dispatch, which have courageously chosen to go against the grain of U.S. corporate media and actually tell the truth.
See, it's not that hard, I don't think. But, that's what we do. Thank you so much, Manolo. We really appreciate you joining us. I think it's really important to recognize this network, this right-wing network across Latin America. And it's not isolated to Latin America either. This is a global phenomenon. The global right, they are on the same team, and they work together, they coordinate together. As those of us who have leftist views, we need to, that's why independent media sticks together the way we do, because we're up against literally an insanely well-funded tsunami of craziness.
Yeah, in a very pre-orchestrated, pre-scripted tsunami. I mean, it's like you could just predict the exact words they were going to say months ago. And exactly, they came out that way.
Actually, I want to say, before we move on to our next guest, and we have so many great guests, I do want to add, because we forgot to do this in the beginning, for those of you who are watching and appreciate independent media and are sick of the lies of the CNNs and the New York Times of the world, who are lying about everything from Gaza to Venezuela and on, you can help support independent media outlets like Breakthrough News. In the case of Breakthrough News, you can become a member of Breakthrough News by going to patreon.com/Breakthrough News. You can literally be a part of the independent media project that we run here, and help keep us going and thriving, so we can do things like we're doing right now, which is come to Caracas and be on the ground and push back against these lies from the U.S. government and its media mouthpieces. And what can people do to help support People's Dispatch?
Head to peoplesdispatch.org. click the donate button, become a monthly sustainer, donate one time. We need your support to keep on going, to keep coming to Venezuela, to be able to be covering what's happening with people's movements across the world. What do anti-imperialist people across the world need to know about global developments and the movements that are shaping our reality today?
And with all that out of the way, also be sure you smash that like button. It helps boost us in the algorithm. Make sure you are subscribed to both Breakthrough News and People's Dispatch on YouTube. And with all that out of the way, we can go ahead and move on to our next guest, Zoe.
Yes, I'm very, very excited that we're going to be joined by Hernan Vargas. Hernan is a leader of the housing movement in Venezuela. He's a researcher and co-founder of the Venezuelan Observatory of People's Economies. He's a member of the political coordination of Alba Movimientos, which is a platform of left movements and trade unions across Latin America. He was also the vice minister of communes. So truly an expert that we're joined by today. Thank you so much for being here with us, Hernan.
You are the expert.
Well, Hernan, of course, you live in Venezuela. You're Venezuelan. You've been very active in the grassroots movements in Venezuela. So when we're talking about Venezuela, we're not just talking about government structures. We're not just talking about a president or a minister. We're talking about an entire structure of people's power, of grassroots movements, of people who are organizing for housing, of people who are defending the rights that they fought for through the Bolivarian Revolution. Can you talk a little bit about, to give our viewers a sense and just some more information about what has this process been like for the movements in Venezuela this past year, these past months leading up to the elections? What has been the impact on people's movements, social movements in the country?
Well, first, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really glad to be here. I mean, for us, it has been a process of deepening the organization in the grassroots during these last months. I think that's one of the main characteristics that defies Bolivarian revolution, that is the people's power, like a tool for the achievement of different kind of rights. You have this new constitution in Venezuela from 1999 that was supported by the most of the population, but it says you have the right to the water, you have the right to education, you have the right to the land, but the tool to achieve those rights has been the popular organization, the grassroots organization. And that's a characteristic signature of Bolivarian revolution. And during these last months, since we actually achieved that the far right in Venezuela recognize the democratic way, because till then they have been in the way of ask for coup d'etat, ask for interventions, ask for crisis humanitarian, ask for blockade, and that last one has been the critical one, because there are, as you know as well, more than 900 sanctions by the U.S. Government that actually has decreased our national budget in a 99%. So we have faced yesterday elections with a 99% decrease in the national budget. It means the right to health, to education, to infrastructure of service has been affected during the last 10 years. That's like going in elections in a war situation. Yeah. And for a war situation, you need to increase that organization that can resist that can promote that people goes to vote instead of that situation. And I think that that's an heroic situation, that the Venezuelan people goes over there yesterday and said the 51% of the population says, yes, we think that Maduro is the one that can resolve this situation. That's actually, I can remember something like that in the history, the recent history of our continent.
I think that's a really important point. And when we talk about, some of the economic damage that you just mentioned, I mean, U.S. sanctions, that was the whole point of them, right? The whole point of U.S. sanctions is to basically put the people of a country collectively in as much economic pain as possible, to let the infrastructure deteriorate, to make it impossible to get goods into the country, to develop, to build. And so people have suffered a lot in Venezuela because of these sanctions, and sometimes they can work in the sense of convincing people, especially when you have a media apparatus that backs it up, that it's actually the fault of the ruling government as opposed to sanctions from the most powerful country in the hemisphere, the US. But that said, despite all the economic damage caused by sanctions, there has been some economic gains in the country in recent years. Can you talk a little bit about that? What have been those gains, and how has it been possible under the circumstances of these really, really damaging sanctions for the country to improve economically after such horrific levels of inflation?
Yeah. In 2012, Hugo Chavez said that we can fool ourselves, that we are in the middle of oil rentier capitalism and only have built some kind of germs of a different socialism system. And at that point, when we see that, we can say that with those germs is that we have resist that attack against economy. How has it worked during the last years? On the one hand, the government has try to promote the production investment, in order to develop the capacity of production of the country. At the beginning of the blockade, you have 2 or 1 brands of the good that we more consume, that is the corn flour. Is for the base of the arepa, the popular arepa. You have 1 or 2 brands. At this point, you have more than 20 brands. And that's some kind of gesture that you can see of how it has developed the internal productive system by the investment, more of them private investment. On the other hand, the state has used part of this national budget into content the inflation. You can see that 2 years ago, the rate of the difference between dollar and bolivar was always increasing. At this point, it has been stabilized during the final of the last year and the beginning of this year, and that's part of a public policy. So you have promote the private investment in production, you have content the inflation, and on the other hand, you have invest most of this budget in guarantee of protection for population. Most of all, food. You have this system of subsidize and distribute food for 6 million people. So that's quite important. It's the bottom of the people with more necessities in the communities. So this is the policy that we have deployed. And in the last time, the government has added a new one that we think that is too important. This year, Nicolas Maduro said, in time, because the 3 first measures have achieved to stabilize a little the economy. He says, in the meantime that we recover a little this inner income, we have to use it for the people's power. So the communes are the ones called to establish a policy to recover all the situation that you mentioned before of health issues, educational issues, infrastructure for services. So this year, we have the first national popular consultation where each commune decide which was the first issue that they were going to confront with a project, a community project that can start to recover the infrastructure of the school, or maybe the public health center, or maybe the network for water or electricity. And during this time, we have 4,500 projects that are being executed by the same community, by the same communes, And that, I think that's the 4th issue that can be a key issue in order of the national recovery. That's important of the yesterday's election. because it's supposed to bring stability to Venezuela in order that we can continue this path of stability in order that more communes can execute different projects. President Maduro actually remembered yesterday in the morning, in the night, when he assumes the victory after the National Electoral Council statement. He actually remembered in the 25th of August, we have the second national consultation for more projects to execute by the communes.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so impressive, and it cannot be overlooked, this economic recovery that Venezuela has had, the step-by-step strengthening of these different economic sectors. I think something to not overlook is the fact that the U.S. sanctions are still in effect. They still have put a stranglehold on Venezuela's financial system. This means that very hard to do transactions with the United States, which was a major trading partner. So how actually has Venezuela overcome this, and what countries have been participating in this process? We know that Venezuela is not the only sanctioned country in the world, and that there are a lot of other countries that are now suffering under the boot of these unilateral coercive measures and have had to find other means to actually trade, to do financial transactions, just to buy food, medicine, and other goods. So can you talk a little bit about this international aspect of the economic recovery? What other countries have been playing a role in helping Venezuela overcome this situation?
I think that maybe some kind of a matter of luck, maybe, but by hazard, it actually are the countries from the global south that are also blockaded from the U.S. That's like Russia, like China, everyone that is not aligned with the United States. But I think that's kind of luck. That it doesn't have to mean with the decision to have a sovereign path in each country. But the thing is that in the last time, Venezuela has strengthened the relations with the global south governments not aligned with the U.S. that has independent projects from the interests of the U.S., but also the transnational corporate powers. And in that sense, you have important issues like important references like China. Actually, in the last 2 years, we have been studying this program for fight against the extreme poverty that the Chinese government has applied. We have exchanged a lot with them. We actually have built a program learning from the experiences that they have and the ones that we also have in the last time. But what I want to emphasize from this is that you don't see an alliance in the world between different countries that are centered in the struggle against poverty. All the alliances that you have are from monetary issues, are for financial issues, are for neoliberalization agenda, but none of them are centered on the health issues and the food issues and the poverty issues. And I think that's quite important in the kind of new alignment that we are building. On the same hand, you can have recently the BRICS have announced this possibility of alternative platform to the SWIFT system where you can trade between these non-aligned countries. So I think that's a key issue because one thing that has been really damaging to Venezuela has been the dependence in the U.S. dollar, because it's some trade merchandise in fact, and they actually sanction us by the controlling the economy. If all the possibilities of trade with another ones are middled by the U.S. dollar, then you have an important dependency. I think that this promoting of a policy of de-dollarization, it's quite important, these alliances that we are building. And then when you move to Latin America, the construction of ALBA or the CELAC, it's really important. In the last decades, we have built a lot of sovereignty in this region. After 20 years, you can also lost the side of it, of the importance that you can have these alliance systems that can protect the democracy in each country and are not only aligned to the necessities of the U.S. If we don't have ALBA, if we don't have CELAC, we won't have these programs of cooperations for health, for food that we have had in the last time, but we also won't have a system to denounce the situation in Haiti. You won't have a system to denounce each tray of coup d'etat in different countries. You won't have, actually, you will have a Latin America that will be promoting the situation in Gaza, in Israel. Only ALBA and CELAC are instruments that can promote this democracy agenda, an alternative agenda, and I think that's quite important in the region. That's actually a reason of the U.S. sanctions. The big menace that Venezuela represents for them is that it's a non-aligned force, not only a non-aligned country. It has led these alliances that promote democracy, promote sovereignty, promote non-liberalization agenda. That's the reason that we are here right now.
You know, now that Maduro has won, and I mean, from everything you've said, there was obviously an involvement from people's movements to make this happen. He won. There's still the threat, right? There's still the threat of the right. It's still yet to be seen what's going to happen, what we're going to see from the right. So I guess my question for you would be, you know, what's next for the people's movements in Venezuela after this win? And more specifically, how do they proceed with the threats of the far right ongoing?
Well, I think that yesterday we faced three main challenges that we have in front of us right now. It's not just the final showdown, it's just a battle that comes to another one. The first of them is facing the blockade and imperialist policy. We're saying to them, you have to respect us, we are over here, you have tried your best with the blockade, but instead we still are here. Most of the population still decide that Bolivarian revolution goes on. But that's, as I told you, that's not, we won and we were happy now. That's a battle that we won, and now comes to the next. Because as Zoe says, we are still under a block. Or still we have 900 and more sanctions, and we have to live with that. Because they won't go back, because those are the interests of U.S. imperialism. They need our oil. That's the issue. The second challenge, it's about go against the fascism. We have a half victory yesterday, since we convinced the far-right Venezuelan opposition, fascist opposition, we convinced them to stop asking for sanctions, stop going for interventions, come here and have elections. And that's a half victory but since they are fascists, they said, if we don't win, we don't recognize. And they started fascists, and they said 4.4 million of people, they tell them, go and burn everything if you don't have what you want. And they have this colonial fascist position that doesn't exist. I recently commented with a friend, I said, maybe if Maria Corina said yesterday, she said, well, we have something like 52, you can have the rational doubt about it. No, but she says, no, we have the 70%, we have all the centers, all the states, she's saying you don't exist, you know? Yeah. You, people's power, you, the people from the grassroots in Venezuela, you don't exist for us. And that's something that we have to face with peace. We have to, don't go over there and burn everything. We have to prevent any attempt to promote violence in the country. I think that these hours will be fundamental for that, because we have to keep in peace. Most of the people want peace, so we will win again fascism. But they won't go back. they will be there. Maybe they will try to ask for more sanctions, but that's a challenge. And the third challenge that we are facing right now, that most of the people over here is actually thinking, is what we do now. What are the things that we need to change? Because as Maduro says, he said this only a few hours ago. He said, we have to change a lot of things. And I want to lead this change. And it's about going, on the one hand, how you can rebuild an economy not dependent in the old renter income, but also how can you build a productive economy where the communes have the center of it. How can you recover? How can you build a new country, a new system, a new model, a socialist one, against a blockade and against fascism? And that's the key issue that I think that we have to resolve in order to have a structural answer to the first two challenges. To defeat blockade imperialism and also to defeat fascism, you have to build a new system that can be a structural, bulletproof against these attempts.
Well, thank you so much, Hernan. That was extremely informative. And I think, the point about the people's movements just being this centerpiece of the Bolivarian Revolution, I think that's so important to underscore. So thank you so much for bringing that perspective. Very happy to have you here in the studio, and I'm sure we're going to be following up with you in the coming days as this kind of unfolds. And as you say, these next hours are critical. So we're going to continue to stay tuned, and we're going to move on to our next guest.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Hernan. That was, it's also so rare. I love that we get to actually host Venezuelans from the popular movements, from that side of things, because they never get a voice in mainstream media. It's always these opposition people. Speaking of which, I think it's really important. My segues are always the best, aren't they? I think it's really important to note there's news coming out that that Venezuela has identified Maria Corina Machado. I guess am I saying her name right?
Yeah.
Okay, because I always hear it in English, because she's very, in the American sphere of things, as a suspect in electoral sabotage. I don't know if you've had a chance to catch up on this. Do you know the details? Because I can read it out. I think it's really interesting.
Let's read it out.
So it says Venezuela named opposition leader Maria Corina Machado as a key suspect in its investigation of alleged electoral sabotage in Sunday's presidential vote. A move against a popular figure. Well, she is popular among some people, who rallied millions of voters to the polls. Machado was among the suspects named by public prosecutor Tariq William Saab. Oh, that guy's definitely from Lebanon or Syria originally. So, hello. Yeah. Game recognizes game. In a news conference Monday to discuss the investigation, President Nicolas Maduro, who was named the winner of the election in a result that's met wide skepticism from the international community. I'm sorry, I just have to comment. The international community here means America and Europe, and Argentina, I guess. So a handful of countries. He has said, Maduro has said polling totals were delayed because of a cyber attack. That's super interesting, not at all surprising though. And we can talk more about who Maria is. Do you want to go ahead and introduce our next guest who's just come into the studio? He's full of information about the far right in Venezuela.
Yes, we're very happy to be joined by Diego Sequeira, who's a writer, journalist, political analyst, and founder of Misión Verdad, which is a great resource for a lot of deep investigative journalism on Venezuela and the region. So, Diego, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. How's it going so far?
Well, we're just diving into all
That's a great question. How's it going with you? Last night was a long one.
Yeah, it was, certainly was.
So everybody's a little, election hungover is the way to say it, because this has been going on not just for a day.
This is a classic election, post-election day. You can see in the streets, regardless of some cacerolas going on, at least earlier on, shortly and mildly, but this is basically the spirit. This, how do you say, empty streets and people not getting late to work, such as myself and everyone else. So that's basically the day
after the election.
The day after that. It's always this way.
So we've been here for a few days, and we definitely noticed, as I'm sure you have in the preceding months, but a lot of anxiety from all sides, because there was a lot of concern about potential violence after it was very expected that Maduro would likely win, and he did win. And we've heard from the opposition for a while now that they would not accept the results if they lost, which is a funny way to do democracy.
It's classic.
Yeah, classic. And so people were a little bit nervous about what that might look like in the streets. I mean, so far it's a bit calm, but I guess a good place to start here is, for our audience, which I think is mostly in the US, when we talk about the right-wing opposition, who are we talking about? Maybe you can start by explaining to us, who is this figure, Maria Corina Machado, that we've been hearing about?
Sure. Well, Maria Corina, in a sense, now it's like the end result of the collapse that came after the last stage of the maximum pressure campaign, if you will, because that was also the final stage or the moment of implosion of the parties that were actually leading this charge since 2000. Well, they come from before, but I mean, in the context of Maduro's mandate, from what happened with Voluntad Popular and Primero Justicia specifically, I'm talking about people like Leopoldo López, Julio Borges, which you can consider them, I was just talking about it outside, like the turbo capitalist.
Turbo-capitalist, what a word.
Yeah, I mean, I love that word.
Wow,
It's a very useful one because it actually explains a lot of things, because they, of course, think about one example. Voluntad Popular, for example, it's part of the International Socialista, the International Socialista, which is like the Social Democrats umbrella global-wise. Just like other parties from Venezuela, which are actual social democrats. So they have like this way to build up some way of representation themselves, of representing themselves as what they're not actually not. But in that arch, ideologically speaking, they try to. I mean, they have to like stealth themselves and show that they have some popular approach and some social conscience, and also, which did happen in a way, a sort of penetration in barrios and barrios, the slums here, what they call them, the working class areas of Caracas and outside of Caracas, of course. But at the same time, they're usually with the most hardcore agenda you could find geopolitically speaking. Maria Corina comes from that part, but she has a different genealogy in the sense that she always has been like the queen of the parallel structures ever since she's been around. And she's been around, if you're going to find the first most important record, it would be her signature at the Carmona decree, 2002. That would be her, but that's not her major debut by the way.
Sorry, real quick, what's that degree for those for those who are
that
too
was,
young
that
to
was,
remember?
Yeah, exactly. Sorry about, exactly. It was what many politicians and people from the economy and also the religious spheres that actually acknowledge the guy who led the coup in 2002 for 47 hours. So it's like a major document in a sense, because it's pretty funny how some of them, including Maria Corina, do these acrobatics of how and why they signed this document, and they say, no, it was a guest list or something instead of...
Like at a wedding?
Yeah, exactly. Like it was a wedding and I got mistaken and I thought it was... I let my signature, my phone number, and my email just in case. That was their excuse, but of course they were trying to make the best of the coup, try to be part of the picture back then, and also, and do some politics and power dynamics afterwards, of course. But in her case, she comes more from the NGO industrial complex, because her first major step was Súmate. Súmate was an NGO funded by NED and USAID.
National Endowment for Democracy.
Exactly.
CIA cutout.
And the classic. I mean, it's just the classic political upbringing, if you will. And she had like this electoral surveillance body, or they call it that way. And also it was important, given that it's they didn't call it NGOs back then. They called it asociaciones civiles, like
Civil society.
Civil society organizations.
Yeah. Love those.
That's the first time, by the way, there's a civil society in Venezuela ever, and it was with them. I mean, before that, if you talked about civil society, probably you're going to get your ass beating and into some what do you call it, jail? But that's not the word. In Spanish, it would be calabozo, but I don't know. So you might remember the word. A cell.
Okay.
But anyway, going back to Maria Corina, that was her debut. in the recall referendum in 2004, which actually has pretty resounding analogies. We can go that we can go into that afterwards. But the thing is that she got her organization was the first one to gather the first set of phony, most of them signatures, which was called El Firmazo. But mind you, that El Firmazo strategy, the recall strategy, was actually not Maria Corina's making. Robert Helvey, number 2 of Albert Einstein Institution, I mean the number 2 of Gene Sharp, and we're talking about the badass on the whole structure, came to Caracas with another major operative called Chris Miller, and they held like several meetings with many opposition organizations and civil society organizations as well, just like this one. And that's actually where they all came from. So this was already within the framework of the soft coup rationale. I mean, this is a detail that many people don't remember. Anyways, that was her actual debut to a certain level because, of course, with the phony firms, signatures and everything else, El Comandante actually denounced it publicly, and the electoral power and the OAS back then, things were very different back then, also acknowledged that there would need to be a thorough assessment of the actual nature of these signatures. So, and also it was outside of the time frame, legally speaking, to actually call for the recall. In any case, that allowed the step to the next stage, which was el reafirmazo, which is the re-signing of the signatures.
You mean the accidental signing?
That was the first.
Yeah.
That was the firmazo.
They all accidentally signed again? Another document?
Another document.
Wow.
Yeah, another document in that sense, because also that became like a database that they tried to hold the government responsible of it, but that was actually sumate data. But yeah, I mean, it was a way to actually know who signed it and who didn't. But it didn't have. I'm going full myth busting here, because they always said that was like some sort of gatekeeping mechanism to actually work in the public administration, which is not true. I mean, I know people that right now are still working in some government institution that actually signed, so that didn't matter that much. But the funny thing is how they twisted the sense of this. And afterwards, we have the famous Oval Office picture with George W. Bush a year afterwards. She has always tried to like say, I'm something different from all of you guys. You all suck. I'm the brightest. I'm the biggest. I'm the most important figure. She is Machado Parisca. She was married to Abranger before her current husband. We're talking about like the big historical last names here. We're talking about the actual oligarchy. Machado, it's a more contested one because also this is even more complicated, but her uncle, I think it was her uncle, Gustavo Machado, was one of the founders of the Communist Party in Venezuela back then, and it's an incredible hero. But that also makes sense if you're creating the Communist Party in the 1920s, 1930s, it's going to be the bourgeoisie, the ones that are actually going to do it. So, but but I'm just because
that's upsetting.
It's upsetting, but it's coherent with Latin American history and politics. I mean,
It's okay. In Lebanon, we have a communism to right-wing pipeline, sadly, too.
Exactly, because
it happens in the third. Yeah.
No, and it also makes sense in the way that many of these historical left figures at the end of the 90s, they all just migrated to the right, to neoliberalism. I mean, it's the same.
That's
pattern.
Interesting. I actually didn't know. Sorry to interrupt you. I just didn't know. No, I didn't know that was a thing here too. But after the fall of the Soviet Union, right?
Exactly, the same. The first were the Jesuits, and then came the left-wing parties. I mean, it's the same pattern everywhere in global South. I mean, so we also had that. Yeah, and regardless of this, of Gustavo and Eduardo Machado, which are closely related to her, that doesn't mean anything but just family ties. She studied industrial relationships, which is a strange way to call how you manage a factory, for example. I mean, how you study to be the owner of the factory and how to deal with workers and how to deal with work dynamics and how to make sure you have enough money for yourself and not enough money for anyone else. So that's basically like the mental structure in this kind of person. The Branger side are major industrialists, historically speaking, in Venezuela. I mean, people with real money. Part of the, they call him here, well, Branger wouldn't be exactly, but they call him Los Amos del Valle, the owners of the valley. Those are like the 12 major last names in Caracas, the Caracas Valley, the people who have run the show ever since before independence. I mean, since the colony. And the one who survived, because we also have a very nasty 19th century, which actually basically wiped out the 90% of traditional oligarchy in Venezuela. So that's where she comes from. Fast forward to 2014. All this time she liked to introduce herself like some sort of outsider and like the most fearless figure in the opposition. She found another major moment in her life, a major opportunity in 2014 with the La Salida operation, which was actually, you have to think about a bit of context. It was 2013 when Nicolás Maduro got into office unexpectedly, dramatically, in a very shocking context, which still, even today, reverberates everywhere for us and outside of Venezuela, too. The thing about 2013 is they actually lost again. I mean, we had like two major moments. First, it was the presidential election. Then we had, at the end of the year, the municipality election, which was actually a major victory by El Chavismo. It was also unexpected by the usual suspects. And after that, I'm talking about a short time span, there was like this moment of this tension of appeasement between people. I mean, I remember personally that I started to one more time talk in friendly terms with a lot of people that I didn't talk to for several years from the opposition that actually were scared shitless, even more than us when El Comandante died. And that was basically interrupted in a general sense because politically there was this expression which was El Presidente made several dialogue calls to normalize the situation, to work all together regardless of differences and do the actual democratic game. Yeah. Well, and that was kind of advancing until in February the 12th, 2014, they launched La Salida, the exit, would be the English word, of course, which was like the most disruptive moment, in socially speaking, in the last 10 years. It actually meant a deep fracture in society because we weren't accustomed to, not in that sense, to fratricidal violence. I'm being a bit extreme, but that was the actual end game here, as to, well, set up this hybrid system between an unconventional warfare resources and, of course, the usual Gene Sharp style context-giving situation, because mind you also, this is after the Arab Spring, so that actually also changed. It was less important to have like the context, the civil society giving you a baseline for narrative, I mean, and also visuals. But at the end, what was important was the people behind that were actually shooting at the security organization, the police, the National Guard here in Venezuela. And it was a violent coup attempt that lasted it was 3.5, 4 months. Yeah, it was pretty bad. I mean, it was pretty strong. But once again, you were able to see two major things here. First, the actual content of the Nicolás Maduro leadership and the smarts and the wits he has to navigate this very turbulent waters, always with the focused on peace, complex peace. I mean, peace is not the absence of conflict, right? I mean, but conflict resolution is something else. And it's like keeping the options, political options, to, reach the other side and try to, make the best of the moment and then work together as possible. Of course, this was like a complete denial, and that's where Leopoldo Lopez, by the way, got imprisoned. And they told her, they said he was a political prisoner. Well, he's a criminal, and also a politician that was in jail.
You could imagine like what would happen to me or Zoe if we participated in some sort of like violent coup attempt in the U.S. I mean, anybody,
Yeah.
anybody,
Yeah.
and then calling somebody a political prisoner after that would be quite interesting.
Well, they even go way beyond that and call him the Venezuelan Mandela, among others.
Oh
So,
wow,
yeah,
that's just like
Yikes.
offensive on so
yeah,
many
that's
levels.
it's very cheesy also, by the way.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
it's
Wow.
well,
Weak metaphor.
that's how far they went as into promoting, because at that moment, both Leo Lopez and Antonio Ledesma, some weeks afterwards, were actually arrested. That was not the case of Maria Corina, because back then she was an MP. She was part of the National Assembly. They always boasted the fact that she was one of the most voted MPs ever, which is, well, it's disputable. But anyway, it's not. We don't have time for that. But what did she do back then? This is important because this explains how she was inhabilitated to participate in politics once again. During the hot phase of the La Salida, the OAS already under Almagro turning about face, if I'm not mistaken, call for the General Assembly. And Maria Corina was invited by the Panamanian, the far neoliberal Panamanian government, to be part of the assembly and to have to hold the floor, but not as a Venezuelan official, but part of the Panamanian. The funny thing is, it was a very I always use it. There's this wonderful word from German that's called Schadenfreude, which is like you're happy with with others. Some other people woes, you know. In this case, it was similar because they actually put into a vote if you're going to be an open session or a closed session. And all the small, very important, lovely Caribbean country voted in favor of a closed session. That was decisive, not only our usual allies. So actually, it didn't work. She wasn't able to, to send the message to spread the word or whatever. But that was also illegal. It's illegal in every sense, especially if you're holding an elected position. So that's how she self-exiled herself from the actual politics, the political dynamic. And then, well, she plays this sort of outsider role ever since. And in a way, after the whole, fast forward to today, after the whole implosion of the major main characters of these 10 years of extreme and unbearable regime change attempts of any sort imaginable, as you well know.
The Guaido era.
Yeah, I mean, but in hindsight, the Guaido era was like the climax and the end, finally. I mean, it took a lot. It was also a long demise, but that was the end of it. She was the one left standing. Mm. And remember, mind you, that she is like a major Marco Rubio asset. Mm-hmm. That's where her politics are in general, because, of course, she's also very opportunist, and now she's trying to resemble Javier Milei's speech, and I'm a liberal in that sense, of course. Which is funny how that disorders all the the ideological coordinates around, right? Yeah. But she just tried to, and also with the Iron Lady mythology and everything else, she's tried to impose her own way throughout the whole process. And of course she was able to do that. She was able to bully her way with a very weak and conflictive remaining opposition parties and organizations, and that's how she won the primary. I mean, she basically bullied and paid her way through it and won. And
boss.
Yeah, how about that? I mean, does it ring a bell in some way or another? And of course, she replies that scheme of things, you know, and that's how she. At the end, I have a cold. I have a nasty cold because of all this. All these days, that's how she actually get the main representation of the opposition, and in a very violent, hegemonic way, And that's basically how we are here and how things. But mind you, since that moment, we're talking about late 2023 and today, in July, end of July, they had to find all these mechanisms to actually make her viable as a option, which legally she never was. This is how enter Edmundo González Urrutia. But as you well know, he wasn't the first
I'm
option.
sorry, who?
Yeah, exactly.
That's the name of the name that you just said is the name of the guy who
Yeah,
actually was the opposition candidate
Yeah, the
running.
poor
but you-
guy, el viejito, that's
the grandfather, but you
yeah.
would have thought Maria was running the way that the it's been covered because she actually kind of was in a way.
She was, but that's exactly. I mean, that is like the essence of her. It's all a parallel thing.
Right.
But power-wise, I mean, Elon Musk even thought she was the
Yeah,
candidate.
he endorsed her. He endorsed her for president.
A little
Exactly.
embarrassing.
And
Pin
she's
tweet.
very
and
much
his pinned tweet right now.
and has been shit posting about us like
Yeah.
10 times already. But that's the thing. They had to do all this sort of legal acrobatics to make her candidacy, her proxy candidacy viable. And first they picked also, by the way, major candidates, major politicians like Manuel Rosales had to bail out of the primaries in order to make her candidacy make sense. And first she decided, I mean, this is a textbook case of elder abuse. No, really. Because first, it's mean. They first said, well, this is going to be my candidate, which was a professor called Corina, also like Maria Corina, Corina Lloris. Corina Lloris, it's an academic, a scholar. Classic Caraqueño abuela that tweets about football and is very right-wing in that sense, also very extreme in her thoughts about politics. But she's also like an individual of the Philosophy Academy, and she has like a major scholar degree. And she's like 89 years old or something. I mean, I forgot her age, but she's a very old lady. Okay. And she wasn't, I mean, the CNE, the National Electoral Commission, which is, it's a power all by itself. Venezuela has 5 branches of government instead of 3. I mean, we have the judiciary, the legislative, executive, but we also have, based on the Bolivarian model, we have the electoral power and the moral and poder moral y ciudadano, the citizen and moral power, right? Which has to do with the accountability and investigation and whatnot. So they're completely autonomous about what they decide. And given that criteria, they didn't saw as viable her candidacy. And this is when another pobre abuelo comes into the fray, which is Edmundo. Also a second-rate diplomat that was actually expelled from the Foreign Service in 2002 because he endorsed the 2002 coup. And but it was the same tactic, and nevertheless, which is, I'm going to put a political figure that won't threat my image, my name, and my options. I can't put any more charismatic character because it could actually turn into a rival. It could double-cross her and whatnot. So she picked these harmless people. These are, in a way, I'm not going to get into how not, but these are basically harmless for her candidacy, right?
No, and I think it's so important to actually really talk about who these people are, because when you look at the mainstream media, they act as if Maria Corina Machado, again, not the candidate, but as she's presented as some outsider, and that Maduro is some dictator who's been holding on to power and is totally like cemented in the political establishment, when really it's leaders from the Chavista camp that are actually new to the political system. It's been 25 years of the Bolivarian Revolution. That's a couple decades. The oligarchy was in power, since
100 years
since
before
ever.
that
So
longer,
it's like it's these people who are, these crazy manipulation of the narrative and saying that somehow she's this like poor person who just wants to save Venezuela and change the status.
She's a GMO outsider. I mean, she's a genetically modified outsider. I mean, just in that sense. I mean, she created her own stage in that way.
Exactly.
I mean, she's a very performative character. I mean, she's insane if you actually listen to what she says. I mean, it's just crazy.
It's crazy. And I think it's so important to highlight that, because also it's not just about where they come from, but it's also what they want, where they want to go, and
Precisely.
what kind of project they
Precisely.
want for Venezuela. So I think, just to wrap up this segment here, can you tell us what is the right-wing plan for Venezuela? We've talked about it a lot. There's been a lot of reference to it. Maduro said, we defeated fascism. There's a lot of references to this, but give us a little more about what they want to do to Venezuela.
Well, I'm going to use a very short example for that, but I mean, that actually, from that example, you can think what comes afterwards. And it's not domestic, it's actually foreign policy. She recently declared in an interview with one of these major Israeli channels that once she was president of Venezuela, or when they won, because she didn't say it that way, she would move first she would reinstate diplomatic relations, and then she would move our embassy, our Venezuelan, to Jerusalem. So that kind of like basically tells you how obvious, on a big paradigm where she's actually placing herself. And then you got the Tierra de Gracia program, the Land of Grace program. With Land of Grace, Tierra de Gracia was actually I don't remember, but Columbus himself in the third trip when he came to Venezuela, the first travel, he approached to Venezuela, and it was a Land of Grace. So it's a major, and she said it up to some extent what is what's going to be about. Not the whole thing, because she can't go fully overt on those intentions, because a lot of people are just voting for her because they are just tired of the situation. They want change in that sense. They want a better living. I mean, of course, after 10 years of this, it's perfectly understandable, but they're being gaslighted in that sense also, because she's talking about major privatizations. She comes also in the council of experts around her has like the most hardcore, heavy types, just like Ricardo Hausmann from the Growth Lab at Harvard, for just one descriptive and sort of famous example. So yeah, that was basically it. It was nationalicide. I think that's it. The nacionalicidio is the way we use it. But yeah, it was basically to destroy everything and anything. And mind you that within the opposition, she's the only one after this at this point. All the other ones are just outside of the frame. And then you have like the other opposition, which actually they're actually into the political game, regardless of their politics.
Yeah, no, and I think maybe just expanding a little bit more about what would this mean, for example, for all of those social programs that have been started in the past 25 years? What would it mean for the missions, for the communes,
sure,
for all, and even for the regional integration platforms?
No,
what
absolutely.
would that kind of
Absolutely.
right-wing mean for the people?
Well, in the social front, she's the only one that candidly has spoken about this needs to end. We need an entrepreneurial state. We need a state. What's the Tierra de Gracia document says? A state based on the service at the service of the citizenship. Citizenship also has. I mean, semantics here really matter.
Right.
So it has a lot to do with that. I mean, and also, you remember yesterday how these two. They were National Guard, I think. These two soldiers at some polling station where she went to vote, tried to shake Maracorina State, tried to shake their hands, and they refused because, of course, another major issue for her is the national, the Bolivarian National Armed Forces. And you can also think how that's going to be reduced and how they're going to work their way there also, and how they're going to actually dismantle, for example, las milicias, which is like the fifth component. It's of course, el pueblo en armas, the people in arms, and so many things. It was going to be just such an aggressive dismantling. Each and every candidate, including Capriles back in the day, Enrique Capriles, the twice losing candidate in less than 5 months, they all had to stealth their way, and they have to adapt to the Chavismo parlance and say, no, we're going to keep the misiones, but we're going to improve them. We're going to make it more efficient. They have to do that with most of these social programs because they know it's bad for optics if you go against them.
They're popular. Social programs are popular.
Yeah.
That's ultimately what it comes down to. It's like how, in the U.S. they have to kind of entertain Medicare, even though they'd love to just dismantle it and take it away. Diego, that was a fantastic breakdown of
Thank you.
what is a formidable opponent, I must say. The right wing doesn't give up. They are persistent. I will give them that.
No, of course, and they have the cash, and they have the energy, and they have the sponsors to do it.
Yeah. They have the biggest power in the region behind them. I mean, they have
Yeah, I mean, there was
no joke to have America.
there was no
backing
other.
them.
There was no option with Maria Corina.
Yeah.
I thought it was funny how many, regional leaders said, she's my best friend, and I'm behind her in this. Apparently.
Finally, it's funny how the politics of affection has to do something with. I mean, has a meaning here. I mean, we're talking about politics, not about friends.
Not about friendships.
Well, on that note, Diego, thank you so much for joining us. We really
you.
appreciate it, and we look forward to hearing from you as this continues to develop.
It will continue to develop. Oh, thank you. Sorry, I'm late. I mean, it was
No.
just,
Everyone is late today. It was a long night, and it's hopefully the coming nights won't be as long as we see how all of this
Hopefully.
unfolds.
Inshallah.
Inshallah, exactly. On that note, Zoe, man, Marco Rubio. I feel bad for any country who has like an army of Marco Rubios coming from. I mean, our country's run by those kinds of people, but but I do want to say that as we move forward here, I want to remind everybody who is watching, make sure you smash that like button. It helps boost us. Yeah, smash it. It helps boost us in the algorithm. Don't click it twice, though. Click it twice. It undoes your like.
Just once.
Yeah, just one time.
the one time.
Just like it once, whether you're watching on People's Dispatch or Breakthrough. You know what? Go to both. Go to both and like them on
open
both
both.
channels.
Open both.
Maybe not watching them at the same time. But on top of that, I just want to also use this moment to remind those who are watching that we're able to do this as an independent media outlet, as Breakthrough News, as People's Dispatch, able to bring you the kinds of guests, the kinds of coverage, the kind of analysis you're not going to hear on CNN and New York Times because we don't have big corporate sponsors who are weapons companies and Marco Rubio's friends. So that's why we need your support. You can help support independent media like Breakthrough News by going to patreon.com/Breakthrough News. Become a member of Breakthrough News. You can become a part of supporting this independent media project so we can keep bringing you news from places like Venezuela to push back against the mainstream media lies. And then Zoe, how can people support People's Dispatch?
Head to peoplesdispatch.org, hit the donate button, and there you can become a monthly sustainer or give a one-time donation. Support us. We like being able to give you access to people's voices. I mean, what an incredible privilege to be able to talk to Diego and Hernan. Apparently, according to the New York Times, they're actually not real Venezuelans.
No.
They're just Chavista masses that just follow
like
orders.
zombies,
But
yeah.
I don't know. I heard a lot of interesting points from them. So maybe they're wrong. Maybe New York Times is wrong.
Yeah. I think that the New York Times might be a little bit wrong on that, or a lot of it wrong. They lie about Gaza. They lie about Venezuela. They lie about everything.
Everything,
And
it
we don't. So support us.
Yeah, support
and
us.
our independent media project. And on that note, we have another fantastic guest in the studio, sitting right next to me, the one and only Sean Blackman. He is a journalist, and he's here in Caracas as an international observer. Sean, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Rania, Zoe, thank you both so much for having me.
Well, let's jump right into
Yeah.
it. It's been a wild ride
sure.
since all of us have arrived here in Venezuela, about a few days before the election. You actually witnessed the election process. You were here as an international observer. So what we've heard from the opposition, from the New York Times, and I think it's a safe bet that probably CNN, the Wall Street Journal, and pretty much every other mainstream media outlet has been saying the same thing, is that there were irregularities, there was potentially fraud. People are skeptical of the outcome of this election. Something was fishy because it went a way they didn't like. What did you witness when you watched this election process unfold?
Well, the first thing we got to remember is that the pro-imperialist media doesn't lie some of the time, it lies all of the time. And when we talk about the New York Times, we're talking about the same rag that lied about weapons of mass destruction that help set things in motion that are wound up with 1 million dead Iraqis. And there are actually similar stakes when we talk about the lies that the New York Times and the other corporate-owned media are pushing about the Venezuelan elections, because this is obviously this part and parcel of an effort to not not only undermine Venezuela's democratic process and to undermine their sovereignty, but I would argue that they're actually trying to help set the stage for yet another regime change push. And so what I saw during the elections yesterday was a very calm, very orderly, very thorough process. I mean, people were in and out. It's pretty straightforward, and it's completely opposite of this, chaotic, militarized scene that the NYT seems to push. And I tell you, this is my first time in Venezuela, and it's one thing to know that the pro-imperialist media is lying, but to see the lies playing out in real time, to see the lies contradict what you have seen with your own eyes, is a whole other experience. And certainly in the United States, the American people, in my humble opinion, are some of the most profoundly propagandized people on this earth. And of course, the purpose of that is to basically psychologically prepare us for whatever it is that the U.S. wants to do in Venezuela. And so if the Venezuelan government of Nicolas Maduro was painted as this, brutal, blood-soaked dictatorship, then whatever happens to them will be seen as justified. And I think it's so important that we get in spaces like these to talk about the reality of what's happening, to really show what the reality is. And when we talk about, if we're going to compare and contrast, say, the elections in Venezuela to the elections in the United States, right? I mean, before I came here, I was at the Center for National Elections, which is the body that oversees the elections across the country. And this is what ensures that there is a consistent and single electoral process across the entire country. Yeah. This does not exist in the United States, the so-called greatest country on earth. There are 50 states in the U.S. In every election cycle, there are 50 different elections. And so this is part and parcel of how the wealthy elite, the ruling class, the capitalists are able to maintain a stranglehold on politics in the country, not only by having this disjointed, chaotic process, but also by ensuring that only the wealthiest elements in society even have access to the process. Now, we compare that to Venezuela, where democracy is not just a buzzword. It's not just a brand. It's a living, breathing thing that has life and death consequences, because it means the difference between self-determination. It means the difference between having the Bolivarian socialist process and being a slave to Yankee imperialism. You see what I mean? And so elections in this country are geared toward the benefits of the poor working masses. This is why Chavismo has been so popular amongst the Venezuelan people, and it's why they continue to defend it. I mean, a couple of days ago, I was at the closing rally for Nicolas Maduro in his re-election campaign, and conservative estimates put it somewhere around a couple 100,000 people. Some say more. I mean, it seems like there was barely a space that wasn't occupied by some human. So when we get these narratives in the U.S. that the Maduro government is somehow imposing itself on the Venezuelan people, what I saw with my very own eyes tells quite a different story.
Yeah, I think that's so important to underline, and especially this question about the National Electoral Authority. This is the same body that actually the U.S. continually attacks, despite the fact that it has one of the most complicated, convoluted electoral systems, which constantly runs up against issues, irregularities, and criticisms from both parties.
Yeah, we could use a CNE of our own, huh?
Desperately.
Yeah, maybe we can.
Desperately.
Could it be that we could learn actually from the democratic processes of countries that we're trying to attack? Interesting. sounds a little too much. Thought-provoking. But I think it's important, because we're just about 3.5 months away from the U.S. elections, which is a process that has already been mired. I mean, what to say? But there have been serious issues with this electoral process. Everything from how does the candidate sustain himself as a candidate if he can't give a press conference, to questions of suppression of third parties. I mean, in Venezuela, there were 10 presidential candidates, which for some reason the U.S. still said was undemocratic. But can you talk a little bit about this difference, compare and contrast the democratic process here, the democratic process in the United States? We see every single electoral period in the United States voter suppression. I mean, gerrymandering was invented in the United States to suppress marginalized communities in their vote, the black vote specifically. Tell us about this kind of compare and contrast between the two systems.
Absolutely. Well, I think the first thing to note is that when we talk about the political process in the United States, from the very beginning of that country, it was designed to be rigged, frankly, to the benefit of the wealthy elite and to the detriment of poor, working, and oppressed people. The sort of nascent capitalist class in the U.S. understood very well that if there was a direct democracy, if that was able to take place, if it really was one person, one vote, then the rich would very quickly lose their grip on politics. And in the centuries since, that has remained fundamentally unchanged. And the U.S. has absolutely no leg to stand on when it comes to democracy. Because, Americans have very short memories. Just 2 elections ago, in 2016, Donald Trump won the U.S. presidency, and he didn't even get the most votes. Yeah. And the Democratic Party, which is set to be have its candidate be this mass incarcerating cop, Kamala Harris, they love their line on this election as they prepare to go against a swaggering bigot in Donald Trump is that supposedly this is the election that's going to quote unquote save democracy, right? So of course, but if you're going to save democracy, that assumes that it exists. But if the Democrats, excuse me, if the Democrats care so much about democracy, and if that's what we're supposedly trying to save, then why is it that in states like Georgia, the Democrats are working to kick third parties off the ballot? And this is not the first time that we've seen it. This is what I mean when I say that the capitalist class does everything in its power to ensure that the interest of the masses of people in that country are simply not heard, not entertained, not acknowledged. So in reality, we are told in the U.S. that we have to have some kind of investment in that system because this is what is going to keep a worst case scenario at bay. When in reality, when we talk about the Democrats and Republicans, we're talking about 2 wings of the same bird. We're talking about 2 wings of the same capitalist class who both support imperialism, who both support war, who both support the genocide in Gaza, who both support the undermining of Venezuela's sovereignty. I'm sure you both have seen Kamala Harris is already, calling into question the Venezuelan elections. And this is another thing I want to mention right quick. I think we have to acknowledge the paternalism of imperialism. This idea that the United States is somehow qualified and that these imperialist platforms like the New York Times are somehow qualified to dictate to another country how their process should go. You see what I mean? The U.S. is sort of, it acts as the great white father that has to direct its black and brown and yellow children all over the earth because they don't have the sense to do it themselves. And this, I think, lies at the root of so much what we see. Meanwhile, when we talk about the Bolivarian Revolution, when we talk about Venezuela's democratic process, there's every attempt that is made to ensure that it is accurate, that it is thorough, that there are several layers of verification, that cuts down on fraud. I saw a presentation from a Venezuelan official a little earlier this week, and he was talking about how every election they're learning lessons and they're looking to improve. Right? They don't assume that they've got it all down to a science. And this is why the quality of Venezuela's elections are so high, because there's no substitute for having a government that actually cares about mass participation. See, in the United States, we think that democracy means that you can choose this or that ruling class party. It's democratic to be able to vote for a Democrat or Republican. But that's not what democracy is. Democracy is about participation. And the Venezuelan process ensures that there is as much participation from the people as possible so that the people's will can actually be made manifest. And that is precisely what happened this week when the Venezuelan people once again chose the Bolivarian revolution, they chose socialism, and they chose Nicolas Maduro.
It really is incredible when you think about just the way up is down,
Right.
good is bad. I mean, in terms of how all this is described, I like the way you framed it as to actually be here and see for yourself what's happening, and then in real time, see the way it's lied about by our government officials and the media outlets that are run by corporations in the U.S. that reflect the will of our corporately backed government officials is really so incredible. Sean Blackman, I want to thank you for joining us. And also, can you tell everybody where they can follow along with your observations as you're in Venezuela?
I would actually encourage people to follow Breakthrough News and to follow People's Dispatch. If you're not reading People's Dispatch, then you are missing out. Zoe is just one of many wonderful reporters that they have putting out daily content about what's happening in the world, what's happening in global politics, what's happening amongst the social movements of the world every single day. And people should also follow organizations that are a part of the Global People's Movement. Follow the International People's Assembly. Follow the People's Forum. Follow the Answer Coalition. Because what every single person who hears this, every single person under my voice, what we all need to do, if we are not already, is to join an organization and to be a part of the movement that is struggling against imperialism, that is struggling against the ravages of capitalism wherever it is that we find ourselves on this earth.
Well, Sean, thank you. I'm fired up now.
I'm fired up.
I'm fired up. You
fired
gotta get a good Sean Blackman sermon in there to fire you up. I feel good now. I'm ready to fight him.
Fight these mainstream media lies.
No, thank you so much, Sean. We really appreciate
Thank
you
you so
joining
much
us.
for joining
Thank you
us.
both. You're very kind for having me.
Well, I really am fired up.
Yeah, I mean, just the basis of U.S. again democracy.
Yeah.
That which Sean outlines, I think, is just so crucial to keep in mind as we're seeing again in real time figures like Kamala Harris, figures like different State Department officials, already Anthony Blinken, Brian Nichols, coming out with these kind of dubious. Well, was this really democracy? Was it really an election? It's like
It's such a joke, especially because like when I think about the slate of candidates we have to choose from in the U.S., and I know there's a lot of wonderful third-party candidates, but they're not on all the ballots, right?
No,
I
they're not.
mean, there's people like there's Jill Stein, there's Cornel West, there's Claudia de la Cruz, and others, but those three come to mind. And the reason I named those three specifically is because they're opposed to the genocide in Gaza.
Yeah.
And the majority of the population in the U.S. wants a ceasefire.
Yep.
The majority of the population in both parties wants a ceasefire. That is not reflected in the people we have to choose from.
No.
And the people that actually support a ceasefire are people who aren't even on all the ballots.
No.
I mean, what kind of democracy is that? Anyways, sorry to bring it back to Gaza. I just
no,
think it's a really
important because
good
I
way
think
to-
it really permeates everything we're seeing. And as Diego outlined, it's Maria Corina Machado who wanted to move the embassy to Jerusalem. It's Maria Corina Machado who supports Israel in its disgusting genocide against the Palestinian people. And it's Maduro, it's Miguel Diaz-Canel, it's leaders from Latin America and the Caribbean that have actually been some of the first international and world leaders to defend Palestine, to call for an end to the genocide, in week 2.
Mm-hmm.
So, it is part of it.
And the Bolivarian Revolution from the beginning was pro-Palestine. I mean, there's all those famous Hugo Chavez speeches. And not just speeches, but also in the actual way he makes policy or made policy all about Palestine and against Israeli settler colonialism. And you see the same thing in Nicolas Maduro. In fact, after he voted, one thing he said after he voted, he was on camera, was said, "Free Palestine."
I mean, last night at the celebration, the daughters of Hugo Chavez were on stage wearing shirts that had keffiyehs on them.
I mean, there you have it.
There you have it.
There you have it. So the Bolivarian Revolution and the leadership in it and the people on the ground in it are reflective of that anti-genocide, pro-liberation sentiment that's I think the majority of the world feels in solidarity with. So with all that said, we have another incredible guest
really.
Who happens to be here with us in Caracas. We have Dr. Fred Emembe, who is the president of the Socialist Party of Zambia and also has got his keffiyeh on. So here to represent as well. Fred, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Go
Well,
ahead,
Fred,
Zoya.
You were on the ground as well for the past several days. You were visiting different polling stations. We heard a little bit from Sean about his reflections about seeing this process underway, but please tell us a little bit about what you saw yesterday on the streets of Caracas, this electoral process.
First, I should say victory is sweet. Defeat can be bitter, and especially if you swallow it. And it seems some people have swallowed the defeat, and it's bitter. It's a quinine. These are the fairest, the most peaceful elections I've ever observed. The electoral process, the system is tight-proof. Anybody who talks about fraud, he's a fraud or she's a fraud himself or herself. These were free and fair elections, and the results truly reflect the will of the Venezuelan people. It could have been much better. The result could have been much higher, but you can understand the difficult circumstances under which these elections were held. Firstly, there was massive propaganda. Lies piled up on top of another, on top of another, on top of another. There was so much malice, so much calumny, so much defamatory stuff. But the instincts of the Venezuelan people were clear. They voted where they should have voted, and they voted for what needed to be voted for. They voted for President Maduro, and they voted for the revolution. Well, they have never accepted any result from here. From the first time Comandante Chavez won the election, they have never accepted any election result, apart from the two or so which they won themselves. One, the referendum, and the one for the Congress, which they won. That's the only elections, those are the only elections they've accepted. So, and the elections were not for them. These were elections for the Venezuelan people, the progressive Venezuelan people, the courageous Venezuelan people, the honest Venezuelan people. So we don't care what they say. They can go to hell. We have the Venezuelan people have won. And what they want is peace. What they want is to live better. What they want is to start picking up the pieces from the damage they have caused. They crippled the economy with over 900 sanctions. And they want to say the revolution has failed. They injected a poison in the revolution to try and assassinate it. They have failed. They should accept failure. Hypocrisy doesn't pay, at least not all the time. They have failed even to accept their own elections in the USA. How can we expect them to accept the Venezuelan elections? Mr. Trump, up to this day, has refused to accept the election result in which he lost. He said they were fraudulent. If there's two elections in America, they shouldn't think everywhere there's two elections. Revolutionists don't steal elections. When they are defeated, they accept it. When they lost the referendum, Comandante Chavez accepted the defeat. When they won the Congress elections, President Maduro accepted the defeat. Why can't they do the same? And these are not people who have respected the elections. They have sponsored the greatest number of coups in the world. They have toppled governments. They have killed our leaders. What free and fair elections can they talk about? What peace can they talk about? Are they not the ones who toppled President Allende after he won the elections and killed him? Are they not the ones who killed Patrice Lumumba after he won the elections in Congo? How many of our leaders have they killed? These are killers, not Democrats.
Well, that is a very powerful way to put that. And, I want to bring it to your area of the world. I mean, you have run in elections as a socialist candidate in Zambia against the ruling party, and you've been arrested several times. We've had you on the live stream in the past after you've been arrested. in Zambia doing political work. And that's a country that is allied with the U.S. So I think it's really important what you're saying, and I want to bring it to a real world situation now. What are the elections like in your country, and where does the U.S. stand when it comes to that process?
They support puppet regimes. They support right-wing political parties that give them access to all the resources of our country. Yes, I participated in the last elections in my country and lost. Were the elections fair and fair? Not so much, but we accepted the result. We accept defeat. We pick up the pieces and move on. We are going for elections in August 2026. We are preparing for that. And we are hopeful we'll win. We are working very hard. Well, they want to dominate the world. They want to impose their will and their governments on people. We are not ready for that. Time to be rulers of our countries has come. Time to determine our destiny has come. We have to gain control of our destiny. They can't talk about free elections in these countries which they dominate, in which they dictate everything, from the least economic policy, from the military doctrine, to everything they dictate. Can a country that is dominated by another country be said to be democratic? Can it hold free and fair elections? Yes, those are the elections they applaud as free and fair. But there's time for everything. People are getting more and more aware. Their consciousness is rising. They will not accept this domination forever.
One can only hope.
Yeah, no, and I mean, for anyone who hasn't been following the Socialist Party of Zambia and all of the work that they've been doing, organizing the people on all levels, working with the Landless Rural Workers movement to carry out literacy campaigns, health clinics, I mean, really rebuilding from the bottom, from the grassroots. It's very impressive. So everyone who hasn't followed what the Socialist Party of Zambia has been doing over the past several years, I really encourage you to. We have to look more towards the South. We have to be looking at these processes of people building people's power, of building alternative structures to U.S.-imposed crony regimes that want to sell off the country's resources. We know actually Zambia is one of the most copper-rich countries in the world, not the most wealthy in terms of the people's wealth. So
We have poverty levels of 60%.
60% poverty levels, one of the largest copper
We have
reserves in
one
the
of the
world.
highest infant mortality rates in the world.
Yeah.
We have one of the highest maternal mortality rates in the world. We are one of the hungriest countries in the world with all the resources. How could we be poor? They have been mining copper and other minerals since the early 1920s. They have built skyscrapers in the UK and other places. How come, with all the minerals they have taken, with all the wealth they have taken, how come that we are poor today?
Yeah.
There is only one explanation. We have been robbed.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever they mined, they took. They took not only the minerals, but also the money that came from the minerals. They took. They left us with nothing. If they were leaving something, we would have something.
Yeah.
Where there's something, there will be something. Where there's nothing, there will be nothing. They left us with nothing.
And that's exactly what the right wing in Venezuela wants to do with the oil reserves.
Well, that's what Venezuela was like before the Bolivarian Revolution. Is you had high illiteracy, you had higher hunger rates, infant mortality rates, and that is what precisely what the U.S. and its allies regionally, whether it's Latin America, whether it's Africa, whether it's the Middle East, whether it's Asia, try to prevent. They try to prevent movements like yours, movements like the Bolivarian Revolution, from taking power, so they can take the resources and actually nationalize them and give the profits back to the people and develop the country.
If there was fair sharing, fair utilization of the global resources, we wouldn't have the imbalances we have today. We wouldn't have poor and rich on the same planet.
Yeah, I mean, it's That's the real. That's the kind of project that the U.S. Supports. That's the kind of project that its allies support. Fred, before we let you go, now it's 1:30 Monday. Over 12 hours have passed since the results have been released. We've seen, again, you've been following these reactions. You mentioned it. You alluded to it earlier, but how do you understand this response of the right wing, the response of the United States, the response of political leaders like Milei, like Boric? What is your reaction to this kind of parallel bipolar response of both recognizing what was a democratic process and then others kind of just immediately trying to undermine it?
At every stage, there have been those who have hired themselves out, who have been hired by imperialism to speak for it, to promote its interests, to defend its interests. That's what the Chilean president has done. That's what the Uruguayan president has done. We expected some such people. They will always be there. Even Jesus was betrayed. 12 or 13 apostles. There were some Judases at the time of Christ, and there are still some Judases today. We have to learn to live with Judases.
Yeah, the Judases of the world.
Well,
Fred Emembe, I want to thank you for joining us and giving us your thoughts on what you witnessed here in Caracas. And I encourage people, can you actually say where can people follow you and your party?
Firstly, I must thank you for the great work you have been doing, and also for meeting you personally.
It is nice to meet you in person, yes.
We have spoken to each
We
other,
have.
but today we have met physically. It's
Yes.
great.
Yeah.
And please keep up the good work you're doing. People need alternative voices. People need honest voices. People need revolutionary voices.
I appreciate
Yes, and you're doing exactly that. You are giving them that.
That means a lot coming from you. Wow.
It is. It is.
Thank you. Thank you.
Revolutionists tell the truth.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. And I hope we are going to have you back on Breakthrough News and then People's Dispatch in the very near future.
Definitely.
Thank you so
definitely.
much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so
Cheers.
much.
On that note, Zoe, I think it's so important and awesome that we got to, wow, I sound so American. Awesome. It's so awesome that we get to talk to people from all over the world who've come to witness this election.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that's so important, like the inspiration that Venezuela has given to people across the world, the possibility of this kind of project really, I mean, again, it inspires people all over. There have been electoral observers, again, from not just Latin America, but Africa, West Asia, South Asia. The internationalism that's embodied by the Bolivarian Revolution and by Venezuela is not just in name. It's something they believe in deeply, about sharing their experiences, about learning from other processes. And as hearing from Fred is so important because Zambia is one of these countries that the U.S. likes to keep under its boot. And we see what that means for the Zambian people. As Fred said, 60% poverty rate, high levels of child mortality, these social indicators that are devastating for the people and a country with so much wealth. Venezuela, again, it has the largest oil reserves in the world. Mm-hmm. It's not an accident that the U.S. is so invested in constantly undermining the democracy and attempting to bring it back to the way it was, where it was able to dictate, take its oil, and keep people suppressed.
And it's a joke. I mean, we all know it's a joke. Like, the U.S. doesn't care about democracy. It doesn't care about democracy in the U.S. It doesn't care about democracy anywhere in the world. All it cares about is extracting, stealing resources from global South countries like a parasite, so its own ruling class can continue to profit and buy yachts. That's it. That's how it works. And anywhere that threatens that dynamic will be called authoritarian. It will be called a dictatorship. And it's even more of a threat when it's a place that inspires so much of the world because of the people's movement that has arisen in revolution. Yeah. And to that note, I think it's a fantastic time to bring on our next guest, Gloria La Riva. She's from the Party for Socialism and Liberation. Sorry, I can't talk anymore. I'm so sorry, Gloria. I'm going to start over because we've been doing this for almost 2 hours. And this is when I start to stumble. Gloria La Riva, Thank you for joining us. You're from the Party for Socialism and Liberation and a lifelong solidarity activist with Cuba and Venezuela, which is such an important role for you to be in, to segue from what we're talking about, because you're in a very good position to talk about some of the history that led to what we saw yesterday and also the ongoing right-wing threats to places like Venezuela and Cuba. But let's start with Venezuela. You're somebody who had the honor of actually meeting Hugo Chavez when he was still alive. You've been doing solidarity work around Venezuela for a very long time. So I guess, what are your thoughts after yesterday? And can you kind of maybe explain some of what was at stake and continues to be at stake when we talk about Venezuela having an election between someone like Nicolas Maduro and what the right wing in this country represents?
Yes, you're right. A great deal was at stake. And not only for Latin America, Caribbean, but the whole world. Because when you think about the extremely close relationship between Cuba and Venezuela, of this sister-brotherly relationship, and how Cuba has more than 20,000 doctors in Venezuela providing the free health care, and Venezuela providing the oil, although the oil is blocked. And the U.S., Manolo had mentioned a long history, which is absolutely true. And I think one thing that really stands out is how brutal the U.S. repression was way before. For example, starting in the early 1970s, the U.S. CIA actually sent the worst-known terrorist, Posada Carriles, Luis Posada Carriles, to be the second in command of Venezuela's DICIP, the DISIP, the intelligence police. And his role was to exterminate the left. The first in command of the DICIP was an official from the Mossad of Israel. And as the great protector of the Táchira state bordering Colombia, Freddy Bernal, who has also a very long history in the struggle here, he said that the U.S. ambassador's office was right next to a military office, and they directed Venezuelan politics. Why? Because of the enormous wealth. It's not just oil, it's gold, it's bauxite, aluminum, the water, the hydro energy. And also, just like Cuba, or any country that's had a revolution or a struggle of independence, it represents an alternative world. And see, the thing about it is that Cuba has resisted for all these years. And then when Hugo Chavez won the election in 98, took office in 99, and said on his oath, he said, "I swear we will have a constitution by the end of the year." Mm. The first in 25 of Venezuela that was ratified and voted on by the people. The first one to be voted on. And that spread great fear to the United States ruling class. So ever since then, the war started. I came to Venezuela the first time in 2001. I had met Nicolas Maduro in 2000 in Cuba. Young man. He's not that old now. But I met him in 2001 at a conference of the labor federations. And what Hugo Chavez was trying to do was democratize the right wing, the biggest labor federation, which was led by a right-winger who actually was part of the coup months later, July 2001. And there were different forces, political groups, individuals who, with the new revolutionary government, they wanted to be part of the government. They were kind of in contention with each other. And so this conference that I was in for 3 days, Nicolas Maduro, as this activist leader, he played a very diplomatic but firm and unitary role. I was watching everyone, and I was like, this man is impressive. And later, when tragically it was made public that Hugo Chavez had been diagnosed with cancer, the first thing that came to my head was, Nicolas Maduro will be president. Wow. And then, of course, the great, great leader, Hugo Chavez, mentioned this on TV and said, as full as the moon, I ask you, why was that? Because he wanted to make sure, as he said always, it's not a man, it's a party, it's a people. And so he had to make sure that there was one person designated. There were others who would be great too, but really Nicolas Maduro, Chavez knew him. Chavez knew him very well. And the thing that's great about the PSUV, I will talk about the PSUV, and Maduro, is the continuous efforts at unity, even with the political differences. He's even negotiated many times with the right wing. to say we've got to have peace in the country. We've got to prevent U.S. imperialism. And every time that, sometimes they come close to a deal, the U.S. steps in and says, no, that's not happening. So I salute him. I salute his victory, as many people in the world are now congratulating Nicolás Maduro.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean this history is so important, and it's incredible that you lived that and saw all of this. And what you touched on is crucial about Cuba and Venezuela being these kind of examples for the region. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between Cuba and Venezuela historically over the past couple of decades?
Yes, well, Fidel was giving advice to Hugo Chavez at the time of the great attack on the dictatorship on February 4th, 1992. And Chavez gave advice, Fidel gave advice to Chavez as well at other key moments. Fidel, I once met Fidel at an event. We met and we were talking about the Cuban Five, and he said, have the fullest confidence in me. I know Hugo Chavez, and he is a great revolutionary. And they were very, very close. The interesting thing is the U.S. tries to do their different propaganda in the media and elsewhere, try to divide and conquer. So they would always try to say, Chavez getting so close to Fidel, that's going to hurt Venezuela. And Chavez never stepped back. They were full embrace. I was at the signing of the ALBA agreement. And I was in different moments when they were together as well. But I think the thing that's interesting is after the coup of 2002, April, and then the oil sabotage when the right-wing leaders inside the oil industry shut it down, and it was a struggle for months when the interest was super high. There was a lot of shortages, a very severe crisis. And as it was starting to recover with, patriotic people who came in to recover the oil, there was a World Social Forum in Brazil in January, I believe, February. And this was still a critical moment. It hadn't ended yet. And I was there as a participant. And I met with some of the Cubans who were sent by Cuba to be in Brazil. And Fidel told them it was going to be 50 people going to Brazil from Cuba. And then when these things were heating up, Fidel called a bunch of leaders together and said, we're sending 250 of you. There may not be hotel rooms. You might have to sleep in the street. Get a sheet or a blanket. He goes, but you're going there to defend Venezuela. And so when we were there in the World Social Forum, Cuba imported on a jet plane, hot off the press literally, 50,000 copies of Hugo Chavez's speeches during the struggle since the coup. And that was Cuba's role, was we're going to do everything we can. And this is Cuba suffering its own blockade, its own struggle. And I'll never forget that the Cubans in the workshops of the World Social Forum would come in. Of course, they talk about Cuba, but they were there with a duty and a great privilege of defending Venezuela. And then came the doctors. The first doctors came in April 2003 from Cuba, and I was here at the time. And the private healthcare system would not let the doctors operate. They wouldn't have hospital or clinic access. And so the women, Chavez called on the women to help. The women in the most humble places opened up a corner of their apartment or house for a clinic. I would visit some of those. And later, in this audience with hundreds of doctors from Cuba, and the women side by side by their doctors, the Venezuelan women. And Chavez, honored the women for having done what they did. And of course, things developed now, the Elam school. So much has happened between the two countries' solidarity and alliance that has spread. And the other thing about Venezuela was, with 1999, Chavez taking office, then comes the presidencies of Rafael Correa, Daniel Ortega, Evo Morales, and others, and all the people were demanding new constitutions, which took place. And that's why in 2008, when Obama ran the first time, And he gave his May 23rd Latin American speech in Miami, surrounded by Cuban and Venezuelan right-wingers. He declared, we're going to stop Hugo Chavez's checkbook diplomacy, meaning the solidarity that Venezuela extended. We're going to stop that. And he said, because, he was expressing the fear of what had happened in Latin America. And what happened? June 9th, 2009, the coup against Honduras, because they were going to have a non-binding referendum on the question of a constitution. So Venezuela's example is enormous, and its resistance is great. I was here when Guaido was pretending to be the president. That sham. How can the U.S. talk about democracy in Venezuela when they imposed a man that nobody even knew, who let the U.S. take over all the wealth of the country in his name? And so I was here during that time for a month. I went to the Tienditas Bridge during the encounter. The biggest one was in another bridge. But the courage of the young people, the courage of the National Guard youth, the courage of the people there, and then the resistance of the people during the 6 days of blackout. The whole country shut down. So when you think about the hacking yesterday, and when Maduro said, he didn't say who it was, but we all know who it was, who has a capacity to do that. But that was the United States sabotage of all the electrical power. When you don't have electrical power, you don't have water. And I would see people walking over to the mountains, hiking miles to the mountains, to collect water coming down the stream. But the U.S. cannot break Venezuela.
There's one last thing I want to ask you about, Gloria, and I love that. I love that you were able to speak to these sort of historical threads, right? And you talk about Venezuela, Cuba, and this third world solidarity that clearly imperialists are the most terrified of. And not to give attention to trolls on the internet, but I think it's kind of, I want you to address this because I've gotten a lot of responses to some of my reporting from Venezuela of people being like, look, I love your content on Palestine, but you're getting this all wrong, right? I'm sure you've seen that sort of thing too. And I don't want to assume everybody saying that is actually being malicious. I think that a lot of people are so propagandized about Venezuela, much in the same way, by the way, they're propagandized to be anti-Palestinian, that they just don't understand. So I want to ask you to maybe give a brief explanation of why these issues are actually very much related. You opened by speaking about the 70s and the Mossad's role in like a right-wing plot to basically have the intelligence agencies here kill leftists, exterminate leftists. So that's a great thread to like maybe wrap back or circle back to is why is it important to understand that pro-Palestinian solidarity is actually very much connected to being in solidarity with the Venezuelans and the Cubans and the various movements across the region towards liberation?
Absolutely. First, the struggle about Palestine that you have been involved in for so many years, and our party as well, and many, many people, but that it was so hard to raise the issue because of the pro-Israeli U.S. imperialist propaganda, which is so deep in the money that they give, the billions every year. But finally, the resistance that broke out, the renewed existence that broke out on October 7 has changed the world, has made so many youth in the U.S. come to the protests, be a part of the constant mobilization, and also learning. They're all wanting to learn more, and it's opening this great desire to know about what is the history of Palestine, what is socialism, what is going on, and what is imperialism. You know, what, 20 years ago? Saying imperialism was like, oh God, you're such a leftist. You can't say that. And now, imperialism, everybody doesn't always know the exact definition from a socialist point of view, but still imperialism implies empire. And everyone knows what the U.S. empire is. That's not hard. But it's an education that's been from the struggle. And so the fact that Israel and the U.S. always vote against Cuba in the United Nations General Assembly resolution to lift the embargo, as they call it, it's a blockade. And those two countries are the only ones who vote. And those two countries are waging genocide against Palestine. And I think also that despite the attention that's being given to this horror in Gaza, that it's also happening and deepening in the West Bank.
Yeah.
It's very, very dangerous.
Yeah.
And so you see the U.S. with this determination to keep Israel as their fortress, their gendarme in the Middle East, because they can't have confidence. Even if they prop up some of these dictatorships, they know that the people are with the Palestinians. And the same with Latin America. They can't, the U.S. is still basically strangling Cuba. They're still strangling Venezuela because of the example. And the Palestinians are the example not only for the Middle East or the region, but for the world. And so all of this is creating a worldview for many, many young people. The youth are the future. They're not the future, they're the present.
Yeah, that's, I mean, really incredible. I think this strengthening of this anti-imperialist sentiment really opens doors. You do so much organizing around Cuba and Venezuela, and I think we've seen an increased interest in the countries like Cuba and Venezuela that have been supporting Palestinians. As we said before, it has been Cuba and Venezuela who have not only publicly given support to the Palestinian cause, but also materially. Yeah. Hundreds of students coming to study medicine in Cuba, in Venezuela as well. This is a solidarity that's unmatched, and especially by countries in the region that sort of play, knowing that the masses actually support Palestine, try to give lip service to this cause of liberation. But it's these countries that have actually blockaded countries, that have put resources on the line to support the Palestinian people, to strengthen their civil society, to strengthen their ability to actually fight back against occupation by having doctors, by having people who are trained in their society. So that's so crucial. Thank you so much, Gloria, for joining us and giving us that incredible history. We can't talk about Venezuela without talking about that past and that past of struggle that has brought us where we are today.
Well, I'd like to offer something. There is a documentary that was made here by a Venezuelan filmmaker that used some of our footage against the terrorist Posada Carriles, who actually prepared the bombs here in Venezuela that were placed on the plane that killed 73 people in 1976, as he was working in the Venezuelan police. But we have a documentary, and we're the distributors in the U.S., and if you have any fundraising kind of thing, and, offering something in return for donations, we'd be glad to give you a bunch of them.
Yeah.
Amazing.
It's the history of Posada Carriles in Venezuela, in El Salvador, and other places.
Well, it's such an important history to know, and I love that you're able to go deep into that. Gloria, before you go, where can people follow along to see what you have to say about all of this? You've been in Venezuela before the elections. You're still here. You're constantly coming to Venezuela, to Cuba. So you're a very, very important voice on these issues and more, but where can people follow you?
Well, liberationnews.org is, I think, an excellent source of there's many articles written by our members about Venezuela, about Palestine, and also the handle for Instagram and Twitter. I'll still call it Twitter.
Yeah.
We all
Twitter
still,
till
we're
the
still
end.
doing it. Yeah, it's not X, it's Twitter.
Is PSL National, at PSL National. And also, I'm the coordinator of the Atoy Project, which is collecting money for aid to Cuba, a huge amount for cancer meds for children. And last night, Saturday in Chicago, they did this magnificent fundraiser, half for Cuba and half for Palestine.
Wow.
So
Beautiful.
they can look up HATUEY project.org, but mainly look up PSL.
Thank you so much, Gloria.
Thank
Thank
you,
you,
Gloria.
guys.
For being
Thank you.
here. Thank you. Wow, we're so lucky to get to have such a great cast of people
I
to
know.
come and give all this color.
Yeah, because it's like if you just want to know about what happened in Venezuela yesterday and you open the New York Times, all you're going to see is like a half-baked report that has no history, no context about not only the left, but the right, no real reporting on what happened on the ground yesterday. I mean, as I was going to different polling stations, I was reading the New York Times article that said there's major irregularities with people voting. The lines are too long and nobody's been able to vote, and so it's going to be fraud. And meanwhile, I'm going to different polling stations, seeing people entering the polling stations with no problem voting very quickly, as Manolo said. So
Yeah.
it's like...
There was even a New York Times article. Sorry, I remember a New York Times article yesterday when I was going to polling stations as well. and it was quoting a guy like in a positive way, saying that he wants to have big anti-government demonstrations if Maduro wins. And he says, "I'm praying it doesn't come to." He says, "I will go. I will go." Right? He says, "I'm praying that it doesn't come to that because obviously a lot of people are going to die. But if I have to, I have to." And I'm just like, and they like put it in like a positive light, and I'm like, so
You want
people to die because the election went the way they don't like? Like what? Anyways,
somehow that's good for
that's
them.
the New York Times. It's good. That's the New York Times ones. So, so to keep this moving forward, we have one final guest. We've been saving this guest for the end because he's just a superstar of a guest. You know him, you love him. It's Vijay Prashad, Executive Director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research and author of many books, including Washington Bullets. Vijay, thank you so much for joining us.
I love this studio. It's so beautiful.
Because you're here.
The master board has colored lights.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. It's like, reminds me of that game. Remember that game where you hit the lights like Simon's? Oh, I don't know. Sorry. I'm going to stop talking about that. What I am going to say is I want to just remind people that, we are all here in Caracas, Venezuela. We've been here for several days witnessing the election process. And I know, Vijay, you've been covering all of this. Before we get too deep into the nitty gritty, I want to ask you about something very important, and that is a special man called Elon Musk.
Oh, yeah.
Who has been going in hard, like out of nowhere. He had nothing to say about Venezuela. And then suddenly...
I think he realized there's oil here.
Yeah.
I think he woke up and realized that there were oil reserves here.
Yeah. He was like, wow, I got to get my hands on some of that. So he tweeted out an endorsement of Maria Corina Machado, who isn't even running.
Not a candidate.
Right? But we've already talked about, we talked to Diego. We went pretty deep into who she is. But he's also been repeatedly tweeting out just the complete misinformation, retweeting Javier Milei of Argentina.
His best friend.
Yeah, so I'm just curious your thoughts on this man who owns X and a bunch of other things like this car company that I don't like. I'm not a big fan. But anyways.
Well, I mean, he's an interesting person, born in South Africa, in apartheid South Africa, a beneficiary of apartheid in many ways, and also, made fortune by luck in some respects, was able to build this huge company called Tesla. And then, before he bought X or Twitter then, he already entered into a debate about South America. You might remember in 2019, he got into a discussion about pensions and so on. And then in response around the coup in Bolivia in 2019, he just said, we'll coup anybody we want. At the time, it was interesting because Mr. Musk was in negotiations with the far-right government in Brazil, government of Jair Bolsonaro, where Mr. Musk wanted to build an electric battery and car factory in Brazil. Well, he wanted the lithium from Bolivia across the border. So his idea that we'll coup anybody seemed pretty, beneficial to him monetarily. In this case, it's interesting. This may not have to do with the oil directly. Elon Musk has become a very fascinating character because he's taken his jacket off and decided to become a man of the far right. I mean, he was there when Benjamin Netanyahu spoke to the joint session of the U.S. Congress. He's been coming out there on behalf of Donald Trump and so on. So he's sort of put himself forward as a man of the far right. And coming into the Venezuelan election, intervening here with his voice is very much a piece of that. I mean, it might have something to do with the fact that this is a very rich country, but I think he's just become part of the gang of the far right, part of the gang of Steve Bannon, which includes, the kind of nutcase that runs Argentina, Javier Milei. It includes the former Coca-Cola executive, used to be president of Mexico, now very disappointed that his far-right political formation no longer holds sway, and that's Vicente Fox, who tried to enter Venezuela during the election, and then Mr. Cast of Chile, who's a fan of General Augusto Pinochet and whose ancestors were actual, real Nazis. Musk is part of that scene rather than maybe having some pecuniary interest. He's just become a guy of the far right.
Guy Guy of the far right. That should be his bio. I like that. Guy of the far
Guy
right.
of the
Just
far
a
right.
guy of the far right.
Add it right after X owner.
Well, I do think that that's important that you frame it that way, of him becoming a part of this sort of like right-wing network that's cropped up over the last a couple of decades around the world. Because I've also heard you kind of framing this as a part of a class war, right? Because the war on Venezuela is an imperialist war, and imperialism is a class war. Can you explain how this fits in to that class war? This essentially bipartisan U.S. war on Venezuela that has so many allies across the region in a lot of the people that you just described.
Well, this is actually part of the complexity. And this may take a little while to explain, but it's interesting how the United States didn't really have an immediate problem when Hugo Chavez, who was a young politician, a brilliant, bright, star in the sky, was able to create his own political project and just destroy the old parties of the center-right, Acción Democrática and COPE, in the election of 1998. He completely reframed the political calculus in the country. When he first won, there was not that much problem from Washington. Washington thought, okay, well, we'll find a way to control this guy. And then Chavez decided that if Venezuela was actually going to break the chains of dependency, the Venezuelan state would have to reclaim the oil revenues that were being drained out by largely US-owned oil companies. And so he then proceeded to negotiate with Chevron and ExxonMobil and others. ExxonMobil was the most intransigent. And then, of course, Chavez takes the next step. And it's important to understand that Chavez didn't show up, in Miraflores Palace and say, let's expropriate the oil companies. He began a process of negotiation with the US government, with the oil companies and so on. But it was their intransigence, their lack of interest in having a negotiation that put Mr. Chavez into a radicalized posture of expropriating the oil companies. ExxonMobil was furious, and they took their fury into the waters of Essequibo, which is a whole other debate, where they basically went in search of oil on the borderlands between Guyana and Venezuela and created a problem between those two neighboring countries. Rex Tillerson becomes the Secretary of State for Donald Trump, the former head of ExxonMobil, puts the screws on Venezuela. They wanted to punish Venezuela for trying to take sovereignty over its raw materials. Now, that was all very well in the early period. In fact, right through the career of Mr. Chavez as the president from about 1998 till his untimely death in 2013, things began to change after 2013. Oil prices collapse. Mr. Maduro, who becomes the heir to Chavez. I mean, just imagine this. It's like trying to take over from Mick Jagger as the front man for the Rolling Stones. I mean, how do you start singing songs, for Jag? Like, he's iconic. Chavez was iconic. For Maduro, that was a mountain to climb. On top of that, you had the collapse of oil prices mid-2014, and then the sanctions begin to tighten under Obama. But what has begun to happen recently is really interesting. In order to basically go after the Bolivarian project now led by Nicolas Maduro, the United States government had to find the right wing that would coalesce into a domestic ally against Mr. Maduro. But because Chavez had set aside the traditional right, had basically, destroyed COPE and Acción Democrática, the US government had to look to the new right. And the new right emerged in a group called La Salida, which is the exit. It was Maria Corina Machado, Leopoldo Lopez, people like that, who don't come from a traditional right-wing perspective. These people are gangsters. In fact, Maria Corina Machado's whole political and economic agenda is the privatization of the oil company in Venezuela. That's a big push. Well, all this was okay for the US government. They manufactured Juan Guaido as their pretender president. He would lead this new right faction and so on. Well, everything changes when the Russians invaded Ukraine. then suddenly the Venezuelan scenario changed. And I actually feel bad for the hard right or the new right in this period because
Wow.
their situation
Given a
changed
tough
completely.
hand.
Wow, get that Vijay
Yeah.
Prashad feels bad for the
Feels
far
bad
right.
for the-
Exactly. Because can you imagine they're propped up by the U.S. government, and then the U.S. government realizes when the Russians enter Ukraine, the U.S. government realizes that, oh my God, we need to somehow jump over the new right and deal with the Venezuelan government because we need Venezuelan oil in Europe as a compensation for these sanctions against Russia. You can't sanction Russia, sanction Iran, and then tell Europeans, sorry, there's no heating oil for the winter. They need oil, and Venezuela can provide sufficient oil to compensate for Russia and Iran. So the United States has become desperate to get Venezuelan oil on the market. To get Venezuelan oil on the market means basically this new right has to be set aside. And this was a really difficult exercise the last 2 years. You know, it's interesting. At 6 o'clock, the polls closed in Venezuela yesterday. At 6:23, Vice President Kamala Harris puts out a tweet, right? 23 minutes after the polls closed, long before the results came out, where Kamala Harris, from her vice president Twitter handle, not her own Twitter handle, effectively said, okay, guys, saying to Maria Corina Machado and others, the game is up, it's over, there's no more possibility of you guys to win, we'll fight again another day. I mean, it was like a concession speech coming from Washington, not from Caracas. The United States government conceded for the right wing in Venezuela because they want the Barbados Agreement of October 2023 to last so they can start reducing sanctions and allowing the oil to go to Europe. In that respect, the new right in Venezuela has been dumped by the US and they just don't know what to do, which is why Maria Corina Machado's press conference was so bewildering and overwhelming.
Yeah.
Sorry, she
You
did
wanna-
say, no, I just wanted to remind people that at that press conference you're talking about, she said that they won, the opposition won every single state in the country, got 70%. And real quick, I just want to read what Kamala Harris said since you mentioned it so people know we're not making it up.
Yeah.
She tweeted from, like you mentioned, the vice president account, so not her own personal account. And this was before the results came in, after the polls closed, or as they were closing. The U.S. stands with the people of Venezuela who expressed their voice in today's historic presidential election. The will of the Venezuelan people must be respected. Despite the many challenges, we will continue to work toward a more democratic, prosperous, and secure future for the people of Venezuela. So yes, a lot of us read that as saying, all right, Maria, it's over. You lost. Shh.
I mean, the first two sentences are basically banal. Like, you know, United States stands with the people of Venezuela. Thanks. That's the UN Charter. You know, you're meant to respect other countries. And secondly, well, you know, we hope your verdict will be, you know, heard. Of course, that everybody hopes that. It's the first clause of the third sentence that's the key one, where she says, you know, despite the many challenges. Because what are the challenges she's referring to? The challenge is to get rid of Chavismo. That's the challenge. They are unable to get rid of Chavismo despite the privations faced by the Venezuelan people as a consequence of sanctions. Why can't they get rid of Chavismo? There are two problems for them. The first problem is ideological. I mean, you know, I've interviewed a lot of opposition politicians in Venezuela, and they all say, you know, they're all for privatization. How are you going to go to a mass rally and tell people we want to privatize everything? You know, we want to take the land expropriated by the Bolivarian Revolution and give it back to the original owners. How is that going to impress the masses? How are you going to build a mass constituency? So basically, the first problem they have is ideological. Chavismo is rooted in at least 50% of the population, if not more. And secondly, institutionally. I mean, look, there's about 1.5 million people in the communes. You know, I visited 2 communes yesterday inside Caracas. In the communes, there's a structure. You know, they have an electoral machine. People come out to vote in large numbers. People knock on doors and say, hey, go and vote, and so on. That electoral machine is unstoppable. Not one of the right-wing parties, and there's a number of them, not one of them has ever been able to replicate the election machine of Chavismo. So when Kamala Harris says, and I'm sorry I'm saying her name in the Indian way. I know I'm supposed to say Kamala Harris, but her name could be Kamala means lotus. But anyway, Kamala Harris, just to say it so people know what I'm talking about. In Kamala Harris's tweet, she says, despite the many challenges, the main challenge for them is Chavismo. They cannot go past it. And since they can't go past it and are stuck at the wall of the Bolivarian revolution, they're going to have to negotiate with it. And to negotiate with it means they're going to have to shove aside the parties of the new right. And my God, that's why I feel bad for Maria Corina Machado and company, because all they had was the United States. They don't have the Venezuelan people. All they have is the US government. Just as the US government tried to impose Juan Guaido on the Venezuelan people, Maria Corina and others hoped that they would impose her. Leopoldo Lopez, he's sitting in Spain. They're all outside the country. They've lost interest. They're doing other things, making money in business, hanging out with Vox, the far-right party in Spain, and so on. She hoped, and by the way, she and I are about the same age. I was born in August of 67. She was born in October 67. So she was hoping, this is my time, man. I mean, I need to win now, and the US can put me in. But the United States has betrayed. Look at this sentence. The United States government has betrayed the new right in Venezuela. That's the headline.
That is the headline. Wow.
Well, they have one ally left. Go ahead, Zoe.
Well, I think it's interesting, and I wanted to circle back a bit to what you said about oil. Talk about betrayal. I think it was couple months after Ukraine war breaks out. Sorry to go back to the New York Times, but it is remarkable. New York Times runs an exclusive story, saying that top U.S. officials are meeting with the government of Nicolas Maduro, the government of President Nicolas Maduro, that until then, they had not actually recognized Maduro as president. But U.S. officials meeting with the government of Nicolas Maduro to negotiate about getting Venezuelan oil to the U.S., opening that market. Again, abandoning their ally, which until that point they had, just stubbornly continued to call Juan Guaido the president of Venezuela without actually having anything to support that claim. But, they begin to negotiate with Venezuela. We know that there were different licenses that were created. The oil sector was opened up through the Barbados Agreement. In April, one of those key licenses expired. We knew this was going to happen. The U.S. had already said in January that because Maria Corina Machado was not allowed to participate, that those agreements that they had made regarding the oil sector were null. That license expired, but now, as you say, there's oil. There's still oil. Oil is still on the table.
I mean, look, let's go back to the timeline that you laid out, add a few things in. Yeah. It's true that in the summer of 2022, the Russians enter Ukraine February 2022. Summer of 2022, the United States allows an Italian and a Spanish shipping company to carry Venezuelan oil to Europe. So that was actually a pretty landmark event. And then interestingly, in December of 2022, the opposition comes together and says that Juan Guaido is no longer a leader. That moment in December 22 is very important because it means effectively United States government is backing away from the Guaido strategy. So what's the next strategy? There really isn't one. There isn't one. So then General License 44 is put forward. This is to help lessen the sanctions which are on Venezuelan oil. The moment they allow these different licenses to come in to allow oil here and there, the licenses become the tool, no longer the question of regime change. That becomes less important. It's more important now to use the licenses to make it appear that the deal is going forward in a good way, meaning that there will be fair elections. I mean, in fact, the United States government wanted to say this was a fair election. Yeah. That's the reason why, in my opinion, Kamala is the correct pronunciation.
We're going to say Kamala here.
Okay, Kamala, thank God. Thank you so much. I can't say it the American way. Kamala Harris puts that tweet out because she's trying to say, she's signaling that we think this is a fair election. Let's move on with the Barbados Agreement. Guaido is in the dustbin of history. He's already done. I mean, look how the US uses people. They used this guy. When I say things like I feel sorry for them, I mean, I'm not in jest entirely. Like, the guy was plucked out of relative obscurity from the National Assembly, made the president a mediocre, brainless man, made the president, nobody elected, and then he's just junked in December 22. He was only in this position from 2019 to 2022, a very short period. From 2022, because Leopoldo Lopez is out of the country and so on, Maria Corina Machado is now lifted up by the right, not by the US government. In fact, if they wanted to pick, they may have picked somebody else. If you look at the WikiLeaks cables, the way they talk about this group of the new right, they call Lopez, for instance, arrogant. They say he always rides his high horse. They worry about corruption and so on. They don't think these people are good people. They would have preferred somebody else. They don't have anybody else. They're going to have to negotiate with the government of Nicolas Maduro. That is very clear. And in fact, this is actually perhaps an advance because the sanctions need to be withdrawn. They are illegal sanctions. They are unilateral sanctions. The secondary sanctions, even more illegal. They need to be withdrawn on legal and moral grounds for the negative impact they've had against the people. Now it just turns out that withdrawing the sanctions is beneficial to the Europeans who are really in pain because of a NATO strategy to continue the war in Ukraine. I mean, this is a complex set of contradictions. The United States government is not acting on a field that it would prefer. It is stuck. It's given this field. It has to allow the oil to go because otherwise Europe is going to break from the US on the question of Ukraine, and that cannot be allowed. So, here's the contradictions, and the government of Nicolas Maduro is going to have to navigate its way very skillfully through them.
Well, I wanted to ask you something more regional related, and that is, and this has been a bit odd to me, so maybe you can help me understand why this has been the case, is while there are certain sectors or certain figures in the region we're not surprised to see coming out very strongly against Maduro's re-election, a few surprised me. Now, with respect to countries like Brazil and Colombia, they haven't come out and said, no, he didn't win. However, they have had really impolite, is maybe the way to put it, reactions basically saying, we need to see more evidence he won, and not actually recognizing that Maduro won, from people like Lula da Silva in Brazil and Gustavo Petro from Colombia, which I think surprised a few people. And then there was a tweet by Gabriel Boric of Chile that was really offensive, where he basically didn't accept the results and said the international observers that were here were all just bought and paid for by the government. So, that was just kind of like an absurd statement to see from somebody who's supposed to be some sort of progressive figure that was celebrated when he took over, when he won in Chile years ago. So I'm curious if you could maybe help us understand what all of that's about.
Well, the first thing is Gabriel Boric, I don't know why he was celebrated so widely, although it was important that he defeated a man who I earlier said, reveres General Augusto Pinochet. Gabriel Boric, a very young man, came out of the student movement, represents a broad front, which is not a left-wing front. Frente Amplio is not a left front. It's a very broad, lots of liberal politicians and so on. They do have sections inside Frente Amplio that are decidedly against the Cuban revolution, decidedly against the Bolivarian revolution. He is merely representing that. Whether he believes it or not, that's a separate issue. But again, now Chile, where I live, has got its own complexities. There are 500,000 Venezuelan migrants who live in Chile who've come in the last few years. When the government of Sebastián Piñera was in power, Piñera basically said, the door is open, Venezuelans come here, escape the government of Nicolas Maduro and so on. So 500,000, 500,000 Venezuelan refugees, or not refugees, migrants, live in Chile. Now, Chile is a country of 17 million people. So 500,000 is a pretty big number, particularly since they are mainly gathered among the 8 million Chileans in Santiago. Half the population of Chileans live in Santiago. So you got 500,000 Venezuelans. Among those Venezuelans, they are mostly people who are upset with the situation in Venezuela. That's why they left. They left for economic reasons. They left because they're upset. They left for all kinds of reasons, including a lot of gangsters. I mean, Venezuela exported a lot of its criminals. It's a good thing. It's a very good thing.
Venezuela.
For Venezuela, not necessarily for these other countries. It's a pretty good thing that this has occurred. But this is a problem for Gabriel Boric, because he has to deal with the fact that there's a very large population of Venezuelans. They have protested regularly. Indeed, there was a lot of press coverage about Argentina, where Patricia Bullrich, a figure of the right, she used to be a person of the left during the military dictatorship. Yes, she was in fact part of the Tupamaro group, and then took refuge in Brazil, eventually went to the right, then went further to the right, and is now perhaps even been accelerated to the right by the arrival of Javier Milei. She may be even more right-wing than Milei. She was out there, basically inciting the people to riot, to go and seize the embassy in Buenos Aires. That was given coverage. Less covered was the horde of Venezuelan migrants sitting outside the little beautiful Venezuelan embassy in Santiago in Providencia, gathered all around. I was afraid they were going to rush in and burn it down. So this is what Boric also has to deal with. I mean, these are not just political statements. They have all kinds of pressures on them. Now, I don't want to sound like I'm defending dear old Gabriel. I'm not defending him. But I do want to understand, and people to understand, Latin America is a complicated place. There's no, easy way to say progressive government and so on. They have their own complexities. The Lula administration has its complexities. Brazil is not a progressive country. His is a progressive government in a country that's largely, rightward leaning. The Brazilian population is largely rightward leaning. It's not a left-wing country. It's another thing people mistake about Venezuela. Venezuela is not a socialist country. Venezuela is a country with a government that is socialist. It's not a socialist country. The owners of capital continue to own capital. They've not been expropriated. You can, visit opposition politicians and they'll tell you the kind of businesses they have and continue to have. Their livelihoods have not been taken away. So it's a mistake for people to look at a country like Venezuela and say, well, it's a socialist country. No, it's a socialist government which is trying very hard against all odds to establish some kind of socialist system through a process in this country. It's not a black and white thing like, United States capitalist, Venezuela socialist. I wish you could just hit a switch and a country becomes socialist. No, this is a socialist project. This is a socialist process. The government is led by a socialist alliance, but it's not a socialist country.
Well, Vijay, you were following along last night to Maduro's campaign, to his victory speech. You've been following along, obviously, for the past several weeks and months. Now that the Great Patriotic Poll has won these elections, in the speech last night, Maduro talked about deepening the 7 transformations. He talked about a great national dialogue, a lot of different areas of kind of, as he said, deepening the Bolivarian revolution. Of course, at the same time where there's going to be this kind of pending possible threat on the streets. Tell us what to expect in the coming days, but also the coming years of what is next for the Bolivarian project. Especially we have this dynamic of the oil, the U.S., lots of factors at play, but what, in your opinion, what comes next?
Well, the immediate thing is the right is going to be frustrated, and sections of the right might make trouble here and there. That's, I think, clear, particularly if they feel abandoned by their patrons in Washington. I think that abandonment can have its own outcome. I don't know exactly what form it will take. There was worry that immediately the day after today, on Monday the 29th, there'd be violence all over the country. Turns out there really hasn't been. In fact, I was very interested walking around Caracas yesterday. After about noon, things began to calm down. The lines began to dampen. People still came out to vote in the afternoons. Pretty hot day yesterday, so there's also that. You don't want to stand out in the sun. A lot of the voting took place in the morning, it seemed, and things were quiet. Normally, what you get is you get the motos driving around, people on motorcycle, whole gangs of people on motorcycle driving around, beeping their horns and so on. That was still much later in the evening. So the right is going to react out of frustration. I don't know exactly what they'll do. I feel like if the oil revenue comes back, I very much hope that there will be a real thought about how to use that revenue. See, when the oil revenue was there in the first 5 years of the Bolivarian Revolution, let's say from the year 2000, not the first year and a half, attention then was paid towards writing a new constitution, which was passed and ratified in 1999. But from 2000 till roughly maybe the whole decade really, till 2010, the Bolivarian project was focused on redistribution, making sure that the people inside the country had decent housing, were able to get food, education. There were various missions created to target redistribution in a country of immense inequalities. When the sanctions start to hit against the country, redistribution became harder and people suffered great privations, particularly because they had experienced a better quality of life in the first 10 decades of the Bolivarian Revolution. There was a reversal back to what life had been like before. And it was not pleasant in the high point of sanctions. There was very little money available, capital available for big scale capital projects in the country. I mean, for instance, this is a country that needs a high-speed rail that goes along the coastal road from Maracaibo out all the way, perhaps, all the way out to the main ports in the eastern side. It's a country that can have a high-speed rail that goes into Brazil. This kind of thing needs to be built. If you walk around the city of Caracas, I hope there'll be big capital expense to improve roads, to improve public transportation, to overhaul the subway system and so on. Because what we have found in our research is in a developing country, when there is sufficient net capital formation, it really improves the quality of life and it improves the productivity and economic growth. And Venezuela needs that. So I'm listening to President Nicolas Maduro talk about deepening the Bolivarian Revolution. I was extremely heartened because I know that that's the direction the government is going to take if they are able to convert the oil under the ground into revenue, and if they're able to use that revenue as capital rather than merely to redistribute it. And I want to apologize for using the word merely. I don't mean that redistribution is a merely thing. It's very important. People need to have their immediate necessities taken care of. But that itself cannot be everything that this transformation requires. It requires a lot of capital spending. It requires a new, deep water port built in the eastern part of the coastline and so on. And I hope that countries like China, Russia, other countries that have been friendly to the Bolivarian process in this period will assist in some of these heavy capital projects.
Well, I think that that was an amazing note to end on. Is hopefully the future has good things to bring. Vijay Prashad,
the man, the legend,
Wow.
the head of the Tricontinental
I'm
Institute.
already dead. Lucky for me, your producer has a banana, which I've been eyeing the whole time.
I brought that.
And
one.
when I tried to seize it, when I tried to expropriate the banana in pure Hugo Chavez fashion, expropriate, he put his hand over it. You see, look at him. What is the class war over that banana? Anyway, sorry.
It's actually my banana.
It's your banana.
Yeah, I guess it's his now. I just lost
I
my
don't know what
banana.
he
back
did
from
with the
imperialism.
Now it's gone. I don't see it anywhere anymore.
Okay, we need that. We need to share the banana. We'll cut the banana
cut it
into
into
4
4
pieces.
But Vijay Prashad, Executive Director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, remind people where they can follow along your excellent work, writing, commentary.
Well, they should obviously go to thetricontinental.org. They should obviously go to People's Dispatch. They should obviously follow the Globetrotter journalists that report from all over the world. And basically, they should be decent people and talk to people and figure out how the world should be. Be a decent person. More important than, finding the best place to read.
Yeah, that's our slogan for the day.
Yeah.
Be a decent person.
Be a decent person.
Be a decent
Maria
person.
Corina Machado. Be a decent person.
I love it. If you're watching, Maria, that was for you. Thank you so much to VJ and to all our excellent guests who joined us today. And thank you to everybody who tuned in to this live stream. We're so happy we were able to bring it to you. I want to take the opportunity to remind everybody one last time to make sure you smash that like button. Consider it kind of like a pre-socialism button.
Yeah.
To what VJ was
Yes
referring
to socialism.
Yes to socialism.
Yes to being a decent person.
Yeah, exactly. And also a reminder that we are able to be here in Caracas on the ground following the election and the aftermath of it as independent media outlets due to your support. So if you are watching, if you can support our work at Breakthrough News at People's Dispatch, you can go to patreon.com/Breakthrough News and become a member of Breakthrough News. Help us grow and thrive there. And
head to peoplesdispatch.org, click on the donate button, and you can become a monthly subscriber or make a one-time donation. Support us. We're out here for you.
And on that note, I'm Rania Khalek with Breakthrough News.
I'm Zoe Alexandra with People's Dispatch.
And this was such a pleasure. We're still here on the ground in Caracas. Keep following Breakthrough News, People's Dispatch, Rania Khalek, Zoe Alexandra on social media, and we'll keep bringing you the truth against the tsunami of disinformation from the corporate media.